Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Roundtable at the Texas 811 Damage Prevention Summit, and welcome to those who are watching this on streaming video. My name is Jimmy Wang with BizMetrics, and we're going to go around the table and have all the panelists quickly introduce themselves. Let's start with Shane, please.
Yeah, my name is Shane Hart. I'm CEO of Computers Inc., and we make ticket management systems, Utilicate, for utilities and different companies.
My name is Steve Mumm. I'm the SVP of Sales for GPRS, a private locating firm.
My name is Scott Sasajima, Director of Operations for Texas 811, One Call Center.
Kyle Coggins with Centerpoint Energy. I'm the damage prevention manager in Texas.
Thank you, everyone. So the question or topic right now is, should 811 centers be central clearinghouses of private locating, SUE, design and profile, and other excavation damage prevention activities in addition to public locating? What are the costs and benefits? And before we start, at the end, near the end of this session, we're going to hopefully have a lot of great questions from the audience. So just want give everyone a heads up, and please, if you can, think of great questions for that time. So who would like to kick off this topic?
Jimmy, as you posed the question, I thought a lot about a model, like how to think through who should do what. Just classic sort of business theory. Bruce Henderson back in the 70s said that businesses do better when we get scale. So if we get all the resources together, and we can get better results. And then I think it was in the 80s, Michael Porter came in and he said, Well, actually, it's a value chain. You got all these different blocks, and when you put the blocks together, you can get efficient resourcing because of the grout that goes between the blocks. That communication and technology, if better done within one system, it makes sense to have that kind of business. So I think that's what we wrestle with a little bit here is, are we most efficient in communicating and developing technology all within one monolith? Or is that better spread out across multiple different groups that can communicate and develop technology efficiently?
Just going to say, talking about the one call centers, there's a couple different things here, where on the one side with the public locates, you're kind of looking at minimizing damages, right? But there's another side to the infrastructure too about getting people connected faster. And some of this privates and the SUEs is about some of that planning and speeding up the other side of it, kind of two sides of the coin there.
I think that you mentioned, centralizing it is kind of the whole purpose of the one call center, why it was created to exist. I look at it as an opportunity to keep that within a central area, to limit the murkiness it can create, to say you can get your 811 over here, but you can do all these other activities elsewhere. And I think that can provide greater benefit, like you're saying, have it all in one solution. I think it can become a challenge when, I want to restate, the main point of the question was in addition to 811. And so if you start venturing off into other areas, I think it can create more gaps than it does overlap, which really in safety overlap is better.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that assessment because one of the challenges that I always see is that communication, right? You've got multiple different conversations who we're going to be communicating with, and having that central hub to connect everybody, right? Being that conduit for conversation, resources. To me, it makes sense, to be in one spot. So
Similar, I was learning about this, with Texas, where if someone's not a member of the call center, similar thing, there's an additional piece of information. Please contact your local municipalities, right? And some of these things are kind of very similar to that. How do we put out that information? And some of the things is with legislation of getting people to force them to join in. It's kind of like a hackathon or something, or creating a competitive environment. You wouldn't just invite one person to compete with themselves, right? So there's the pros and cons. We talk about the costs and benefits, and we got some big locate companies out there, and we're finding some utility companies diversify their service providers in the field to get some of the better products. So, it's great to say things are centralized, but then when things go slow and they get a little stickier there, and sometimes that's where we see some of those, new companies or new ideas spur up, and sometimes it's a combination of both that we need and to speed up that adoption.
I do agree, especially on the data side, that there are different data sets in different locations that are not shared today. And as a private locator, we've got a data set of utility locations that are on private facilities that we've collected over years. But it's not integrated yet with the 811 system. And problems could be solved if data sets were integrated.
Yeah, and I think, part of what you say as far as private locating, we're thinking it's after the fact of 811, or at least the initial notification is made. We've heard of excavators taking matters into their own hands and doing private locating on staff. And I think when you lose that piece of the puzzle, if they decide to go on their own, then you've lost, the ability to track the whole process altogether. So I think it is better to centralize it, like say having a hub of that information, whether it's the original ticket has attachments of what was done outside of the ticket, SUE, private locating, to create a bigger, piece of the puzzle that may not exist if someone decides to go on their own.
So following up on that, Scott, you have an inside perspective. What are some of the challenges or barriers to integrating some of these other non-public locating activities into the 811 center? And I don't ask that as a criticism because the 811 centers were not set up. The mandate wasn't to do all these things, right? So what should be done for us to get on that path?
It's hard to make a speculation on what should be done when, law changes could be involved or regulations. However, because there's so many different, vendors and companies out there that can provide these type of services, you'd have to invite them all into the process, and you have to find a way to seamlessly integrate that instead of one company's going to do it one way and one will do it the other. Create some standards around what that looks like to have that integration. And again, it's to enhance the process. I think that if you make it so difficult that nobody wants to participate, or it's just not feasible for the end user, the excavators, then nobody wants to use that. So I think it's about that user experience that makes it more desirable, or even just encouraging to participate versus this is a hassle, I'd rather not have to deal with that. I'll check the box for submitting my notice and that's it.
Even generating what's private land versus not, for an 811, it's another layer of data that you have in there, which necessarily is hard to get in there exact. And sometimes you'll see cities kind of take the lead on some of the SUE and the organization and the planning of this stuff, and because they have that data and stuff. And so when we see that, it's hard to get that in there. In some call centers, you'll find that it's almost a manual checkbox by the excavator to check off if it's private or public property. And, there's some, tough things with that, where if they check it off manually and they get some clears generated on private property, it's almost like you don't want to start it too early to generate stuff off that, which might be a manual field. You really want to make sure you get all that data in there. And for the A1 you're really like a centralized map data, right? And the more that you can put in there, AI is a big buzzword we hear in there, but the more data, the better information that you're going to get and the better service you're going to be able to provide for that excavator, because they don't always know what's public and private property. Their expertise is digging in and doing some of the work in there, and sometimes it's tough enough, to get them to make good locate requests in the get-go and be aware of that. So there's definitely some challenges along the way.
I think another challenge is just being staffed and resourced to manage the massive amounts of integrated data that would flow into the system, how quickly things get outdated in our world. I think 20 years ago, if you thought about what was underground, you would say, oh, it's pretty simple, I can figure it out. But today, and in the next 20 years, it is becoming a spaghetti bowl under the ground. And so how do you think about, or how do we as an industry manage that complexity that comes with all this data?
So following up on that, Steve, is the distinction between public and private locating so clear for the end users of damage prevention? And should it be that clear? Because there are systems elsewhere in the world where there's really no distinction, right? Because I either hit something or I don't. It doesn't matter if it's private or public. And have we advanced enough, progressed enough, due to the work of everyone in this room, progressed enough that distinction is not so important anymore?
There is truth to the fact that if I'm an excavator and I'm digging, that whether it is private or public, I'm going to hit something. And the better we can enable that excavator, the better we can drive damage prevention. So I don't know exactly what the mechanism would be. Like, do we need to consolidate, or do we need to just have the ability to share information better?
I think the A11s can definitely set the rules for how to play, right? And they're not going to be able to do one thing overnight and have everyone there. But if you set some more grounds, like even, for example, sometimes the private's up to the meter and beyond that. And you'll have utilities and locate companies, as long as they're not liable, then they're not too worried about that, right? And trying to bring them uniform, because some of the biggest damages are ones that it is on private property and it's just a little landscape job, but something really bad where, the gas follows the path of least resistance. And those are some of the terrible ones. So definitely a challenge on trying to define, where that private line is. And when you have things that are a little murkier like that, getting that education out. I mean, a lot of 811 centers, they're not necessarily software companies. And so a lot of the time is on the public awareness and getting those messages out and more branding, more marketing, and getting the information out to those excavators, because they're busy and they need to get it in front of their face.
Yeah, and that goes back to the original comment I had about 811 centers being the central hub. We've worked so hard to get the message out there, and even there's so many that don't know about it. Maybe they're not professional excavators, but to just make that one call or submit that one notice to us online versus, okay, I have to go here, I have to go there, oh, I can't do this because maybe some liability, or it's not belonging to that particular facility once it's private, and I have to go over there too. We need to keep it all as seamless as possible. And yeah, we're not there today, but the opportunities exist.
The technology's there too to do more openness with the call centers. You know, API is a popular word, and just being able to connect systems. And when we have GPS locating and stuff, you know, you can push that real-time information back to the call center. Sometimes I find that, you know, call centers being state to state and versus nationwide or something, you get a little differences, and you have to program things a different way to get that information in there. And then you get to a different problem where, like, if I'm a public utility, I'm putting it in there, but I don't see how maybe a private locate company, they would need an incentive to push their private data into your system to make that, because you guys have worked hard to collect that along the years, right?
I do believe, though, everybody in the industry at the core is concerned about damage prevention. It is why we work. It is why we come to the job every day. And yes, there may be some bucket of incentives that have to be structured, but I think there's a lot of motivation in the industry to continue to drive towards zero, to continue to eliminate hits.
I would agree. It's not just industry, it's community. You know, that's what makes us all part of why we wake up and do what we do every day.
So are there any, besides an original question, private locating, Sue, design and profile, are there any other, like, I guess, activities? To Scott's point about A11 being, the A11 centers being the hub of this, I guess, allocating or distributing information.
Yeah, there's
right?
an example.
What else?
There's an example in Western Canada where they're starting to do overhead alerts, right? And we have some utilities that have looked to use our program for that and have talked about that. And sometimes the one call center from one place isn't on the same page as another, and you'll get some different strategies. But you know, same with the privates and the SUE. Those are kind of two different things. The private's kind of to be safe, but the SUE is to build share information and speed up the planning. But you know, when we talk about safety and reducing zero damages, well, the aerial and, you know, driving your trucks or hitting it with your equipment is a big deal too. And we've seen an example of that where, you know, an 811 center can provide more of a service, and it's just a fairly new thing recently. So we're starting to see what that's like and get the feedback, but I think it's quite positive initially.
Yeah, some of the states we work with do have you know, state-specific requirements, whether it's regulation or just a board requirement to have overhead lines as part of their notification process. But that's the bigger challenge that, you know, we talked about, is it varies from one to the next of what we need here versus what we need there, and then what are, you know, the facility operators and members willing to pay for, or what don't they want to receive. You know, maybe they're only focused on underground, but I would agree at the end of the day it's all about public safety.
Right, because you know, that I know Canada does not have the luxury of having A11, but that A11, that three-digit number is just very easy to remember, right? Because it's one below 911. So, you know, we've talked about the different services that can be potentially also distributed, right, at the A11 center hub. Are there any, like, other stakeholders that are not currently stakeholders in the damage prevention industry who might also see benefits and from, you know, joining A11 or contributing in some way, whether it's data or their services, you know, just kind of brainstorming?
I think the type of construction continues to get more complex. The telecom industry right now moving at a rapid pace to get 5G infrastructure installed across the US. It is a different pace, a different type of construction. So those changes in the industry may also create new needs for the way that we manage.
We're about to find out some more things too as the work increases over these next years with new bills coming out and stuff, and the increase in, you know, construction spending. Once you get the larger activity, you know, the new problems will start to show themselves, right? And so what's really important is kind of adaptability and the ability to handle things quickly, whether you're an 811 center or whether you're a ticket management software or utility as well, or a service provider, right? Being able to be quick and things come up is very important to, you know, get people on the same page and get them to awareness and get them to connecting and doing things properly, right? Being that agile is a popular word for that.
I think there's also benefit in the fact that not every ticket is created the same. A design ticket is a little bit different than other tickets, and by bringing parties together, we can find new ways to serve those individual needs of the constituents.
Funny, you see like open source is a popular thing when you talk about technologies, and a lot of times when you connect things on the web through APIs, you're just going to other websites and grabbing information. Like if you work with Esri and stuff and you look at all the available maps that you can pull into your map already. And I think that's kind of a movement in the future about the openness of some of these systems, right? You get enhanced security once you get openness, right? You got to make sure you have your security controls in place, but as you make that, and you have APIs, a lot of companies have some skilled people in-house to be able to pull that information. So it might not be necessarily having it there and everyone connect right in that one spot, but it might be, creating the openness to that data that other people can pull into there and make a real-time duplicate on their systems as well to be able to leverage it, right? And there's a lot of GIS analytics that come in to predict damagers or to predict work and so forth. So I think the openness will be a big thing.
What are some of the, we've talked a lot about the benefits, right, of potentially extending the 811 centers as hubs of information and distribution of work. What are some of the costs or risks of doing that, or barriers?
Probably the risk that I hear the most is I don't want to share my data, right? There's something either confidential or proprietary or strategic about the location of my assets, and there's a barrier to sharing those. I'd be interested in your perspective on this one.
Yeah, and that's tough, right? I think the concept is we want to share information, right? We want to be able to provide the mapping. I think to your specific point, right? Here's some deconfliction opportunities, and I think you can set conditions, upright. Whether you're having some agreements, say, hey, this is what we can agree to on these specific types. But when you're utilizing the systems, and I've been very successful at this in other parts of the industry, is utilizing notifications through an 811 center to connect with the engineers or these surveying companies to have that sharing of information. And we've seen significant results, right? Because we are in those conversations. You're planning a year out in advance, right? And you've got those deconflictions in place. So it's possible, right? And I think that's a direction that I think I feel comfortable at least having that conversation with others. So I like the approach, and I think it's a good direction to take.
And we saw Shell share the location of all of their pipelines. I think more companies are stepping forward and saying, hey, there's real benefit if we have awareness to where the assets are.
I think another thing to be considerate of too is that the 811 center is bound by regulation to not share a map externally at the moment, but partnerships and opportunities can address that issue in the long run. But as we were talking about earlier, the data that's been captured from SUE is something that just maybe is underutilized or not even tapped into at all. So to be able to bring that together to enhance the overall accuracy of where some of these things are versus where they're believed to be is a huge opportunity. And I didn't want to miss the chance to address your previous question, Jimmy, is really one other stakeholder that could benefit is first responders. There's many opportunities where they could be notified of an incident that could be where they need to be responding to, even though an excavator or whoever might be involved, or maybe it's just a John Q. Public that wants to make us aware of an incident to trigger something to them so they can respond accordingly to an incident or an accident.
Well, even when you look at, say, satellite imagery, right? We have Hurricane Ian, the devastation, the damage it caused there. And when we talk about, looking at map data, well, imagery is map data as well. It's just another layer on there that things overlay. And as you get into this, and looking at the call center's data, what was there previously, and you get some of the satellite imagery, you might be able to tell quicker about where you need to go and set up the power back, and you might be able to improve some speeds on how fast you bring people up to be connected.
So, Steve, following up on your comment about first responders, does Texas 811 do that right now, or have you been talking with them, or it's an idea that you have?
No, it's just talking with other centers that have plugged in certain ways to address, say, response to hurricanes or other natural disasters. And so I think there's opportunities. We don't want to overwhelm them, of course, because there's already a massive load of tickets that are in the system. But being able to identify what conditions would they like to be notified of, so they can be made aware of it versus waiting for someone to call 911, and sometimes that just doesn't happen, or it's not part of the thought process as a result of what's going on.
Thank you. I think I called you Steve. Thank you, Scott. Kyle, you're the only plant owner on there, on the stage. So what are your thoughts? It wasn't clear what your answer was regarding the data and sharing, more willingness to share data with, maybe the public or stakeholders. What's your perspective on that? Maybe not necessarily CenterPoint's official position, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts is yes, right? You want to share that information, especially in the planning phase. I think that's where it's key, right? Is knowing where the conflicts are going to be, understanding how you can plan your work better, right? Whether it's on this side of the road, that side of the road, or this type of pipe, you have to have certain clearances, right? A lot of that information can be done initially, and it is a lot at this point. But I've received a lot of conversations from 811 centers. Who do we contact to have these conversations? What processes are in place, to transfer that information? So, for me, I'm for it, right? And I think it makes sense. I think that shares that conversation, the communication with the partners that's working with you. So, yes, I'm fully in favor of that. Me personally, from a damage prevention professional, right? I want more information in the hands of everybody so we can talk together on how to reduce those damages.
We handle some CenterPoint stuff for a company, On the Spot Utility Resources, and we made a push for sharing the map data instead of being stale data, and that was a new thing for them to say, hey, we'd give you pushes monthly and we'd do it the old ways, and it's not always easy to make someone do things a new way. And I know the team's been great over there, and maybe the cost, is maybe a few more Esri licenses or something like that, but they can do some blanket ones and so forth. But it's actually created quite a benefit to have the real-time data be in there so that they're seeing what other veteran people are seeing. So when they're looking at the map and they're communicating, that they're talking about the same things. And as updates are in there, it's less manual work to keep that process going. So it's actually been quite beneficial over there. And you see that at one layer, and hopefully that keeps going through the company at other areas, whether it's sharing with the 811 and sharing some things in real time versus just a service layer. Right.
I think it is, technology has given us access to things that we didn't have before. The life cycle of a building, for instance. During construction, you've got a BIM model and a very specific set of information that sometimes doesn't get passed to the next phase of building maintenance and construction in next phases. And every time we lose that information along the life cycle, we lose the ability to know something about that asset. And so I think that is a true opportunity for us as an industry, is just to try to tie together the wing-to-wing aspect of a facility or a building.
Curious about that with the planning versus, obviously the 811s are very big on doing the public locates and so forth, but what percentage you say are utilities putting the same effort into their planning requests that they get, or do they want them? Do they share the information back? What's the planning ratio for planning tickets versus public tickets?
As far as design and survey tickets right now, very, very low, less than 1% of our tickets, probably a fraction of a percent. And we've gotten feedback that those are not usually responded to, and because they're not actually having an excavation take place. But we do advise in those situations that if you are driving pins, stakes, you're still breaking soil, to call those in as routine tickets. Now, they may still come across as a routine or normal ticket, but they'll be specifying what their plan or nature of work designs would be, and hopefully, that's where the coordination can take place.
Those things even like control monuments. We had one client of ours where they would just have nothing else but just a disclaimer. Every time a request came in around there's some control monuments, it was just a disclaimer telling them how to put them back correctly, right? And what they would use that as an opportunity to see people that might disrupt those control monuments out there to track the property lines and so forth, and just educate, use that as times to educate. So, I think earlier, Jimmy asked a question about what different processes are there, in the control monuments. And I think another one too is just scheduling of the excavators. Sometimes, they're always an afterthought on the scheduling, but as locates are getting done and things get done there, if you had their scheduling information, they became better planners, that would really drive some major efficiencies on there. And so sometimes I see excavators really struggling to schedule their jobs and coordinate it with the locates, and then it becomes a bit of a mess between the two because they don't. Because we do have, renegotiating dates from the excavation side and being able to track that stuff there so that we can better, more efficiently put in our resources for locators and so forth.
So it sounds like we have consensus that it's a good idea, right? It's a good idea to at least explore more. And Scott, you mentioned potential next steps, which is get stakeholders or the key stakeholders, or at least their representatives. I mean, you can't get every stakeholder in the room. Hopefully you can get a lot of them, right? So what are the next steps to explore this idea, flush it out more? Like, is it really a good idea? And if so, how do we implement? What are some of the next steps here?
Just from a broad perspective, I would say it's to invite the stakeholders to have the conversation, beyond an hour discussion. I think that helps, understand what the opportunities look like feasibly. And, as you asked earlier, we really didn't touch on what costs are. We talked about what maybe the risks are, and that's, the counterbalance to the equation, but the benefits are tremendous, right? I think we all would agree that the more information, the more overlap versus gaps in damage prevention would be part of the solution. So having those conversations with some of those key, groups, stakeholders, understanding what those possibilities look like, understanding, the cost would be probably the other half to really start understanding where we can go and then what it takes to execute on that. But also where we need to be looking 2 or 3 steps ahead, because this is already looking there, but what does it look like to operationalize that?
A lot of times it's expense side, right? Everyone assumes 811 is expense side. How can I reduce my expense side all the time, right? And we were talking yesterday at the other roundtable, Jimmy asked about how do you go show the ROI, right? And the difference between the SUE versus the public locates is the SUE has a beneficial income. So I think that's a way to get some stakeholders a little bit excited about it. If you show, hey, if we can help your planning and help synergize, a lot of the times the utility will work with one contractor and they'll have great synergies, but they won't have the same efficiencies or availability to other excavators that might do work for them. So I think if you had just the same as a public awareness, and you can show them that the ROI, the value added to SUE, if you do it even initially as a promoting other SUE companies, and then them to just get their more information and get, better maps gives you so much benefits for so many activities inside all their operations of a utility.
So, Shane, you mentioned costs, and both of you gentlemen mentioned costs. There's going to be some incremental costs, but aren't those costs displacing or replacing even bigger costs right now in terms of not only damages, but the stakeholders of these services that we're discussing, adding onto the 811 centers in terms of their marketing costs or their sales costs or their that are probably less efficient right now, or they're acquiring information costs that are probably less efficient right now than having all that at like an 811 center. I mean, aren't there some cost savings? There should be some net cost savings, shouldn't there be?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you alluded to this earlier on the discussion, right? There's going to be that, initial approach, right, that investment. But when we see the better coordination on the back end, we got people working together, you're more efficient. It's at least in my view, right, in the perfect world, it is going to be more efficient. It's going to have that cost savings to it. So, yes, I think. That's, how I see it.
Well, a lot of people are planning for today.
Yes.
They don't always look at,
Yeah.
the 5 years down the road. And if that was the case, you'd have way better mapping across. But the reality is the mapping that people have, sometimes they'd love to be a little bit better on the planning and the SUE, but they don't know where anything is, right? So that makes that real difficult. So even, as we go through with the technology, getting people to have better maps is a good base to look at these next level things on how can we, track parcel data to see if it's private or non-private, where exactly the meters are, and even for a utility company to know how many meters do we have on private property versus public, right? There's some interesting things there, but as a base, just getting that data and the mapping, there's so many benefits that come from that.
Another cost probably is equipping locators with the equipment so that they can locate and update maps along the way, that cost to the industry will be immense, but technology is evolving very quickly as well. So the cost of technology is coming down, and like anything, if we're investing in that technology, the cost will come down per unit very quickly.
Not only that, it'll pay dividends. You know, I think you've hit on something for me that's very important. Is that we've talked about it in all industry conferences or summit. You know, the importance of highly accurate, updated mapping data. You know, once we get to that point, the possibilities of augmented reality, the possibilities of not having to put physical paint and flags on the ground when it's not necessary becomes a reality. But to only have 1 or 2 out of maybe 5 participating, you know, members getting to that point, it'll go back to, okay, well, I've half the equation over here and the other half I have to rely on waiting someone to come respond. And so, you know, we are faced with an industry right now that's just overwhelmed with the amount of notices that's just outpacing, you know, the supply to meet that demand. And so I think that's one of the keys to get there, but that's a huge investment. But it doesn't have to be, or at least doesn't have to be considered something to be avoided, you know, to get where we want to be in the long run.
Yeah, and you know, I've had some conversations specific to this the last couple of days, and you know, when we have the mapping, right, we have the GPS capabilities specific to that. I mean, you did say, you know, you're going to really be a lot more efficient. And think about the safety side, right? I mean, just from the ability to access lock gates, jump, you know, fences, right? You have the ability to be more efficient with the locator, right? And then you have clean, accurate information. I mean, really, I think in my view, you know, when you get to that point where you have correct maps, you have the technology, there's that initial investment, but you know, we're struggling with headcounts, right? I mean, when you talk everywhere, right? How do we fill people? Well, let's be more efficient, right? And let's utilize technologies to do that within our industry on issues that are extremely important and safe, right? I mean, there's various different levels of success, you know, that we get just from that specific.
And sometimes it doesn't line up, you know, you have quarterly incentives and performance reviews, you know, and it's like, well, this technology is for 5-year stuff and I might only be here for a year and I got to do real good this month, you know? And so that being real good for that month is more about a cost cutting thing than the reinvestment. So sometimes that's a big cost, you know, just the way they look at it. And I think it's funny with the, you know, the augmented reality and, you know, an excavator right now, unless we have everybody getting stuff in there, you know, he puts on his AI glasses to view 1 or 2 infrastructures, then he's got to look at, you know, a couple photos, and then he pulls out some paper service cards, you know, and now you've really added extra costs to that excavator, and he has to have the training of all those different devices, right, of how do I use those. So sometimes they're like, let's just do it the way it was before, I know this way. So not just the performance bonuses or the reviews, but also getting the training on these guys, you know, that has a major cost.
So, Kyle, I'm going to pick on you because you're the only plant owner on there. And this question is not, you know, we don't need any trade secrets from your company per se, but just from the perspective of plant owners, how do they typically, because you've espoused some very like forward-looking views here, but how do the plant owners generally look at, and Shane hit on this point, investments that have a longer term payoff, right? Like getting very accurate prints and the payoffs may be a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, versus just an expense of keeping the motor, keeping the car going. Like, how do they look at it, and maybe how should they look at it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, right? I think, you know, specific to that question, you know, it starts with, then I'm trying to figure out how to answer this one. You know, I think they look at it proactively, like in a positive way. So we have an issue, right? Damage prevention is a specific risk, and I can talk specific to that investment and, you know, what I want our program to look like as a whole. And there's significant support there, right? We're looking at the risk on it. There might be an initial investment, and just to use the example, right? GPS or updating of the mappings, right? Locating through the GPS capabilities, right? If there's a potential, and just, you know, in the conversations that I have with our group and industry-wise, if there's a potential, you know, to have a reduction in damages as a whole, increased performances, right? I'm looking at, you know, reducing bleed off, right? Safety from the locators, right? How do we have an accurate locate? You know, we've got the issues with, you know, tight easements, right? How do we look at all of these issues? They're not going to go away today, right? And we've got to start looking at opportunities through technology, other things to reduce that. And I think, from a strategic standpoint, those are the conversations happening at the operator level. How do we get better and anticipate, some of these challenges that we know we're going to face? We've got to reduce risk, right? We've got it from a damage prevention standpoint, and we have to plan for that. And I think those discussions are favorable, and people are, certainly getting on board. So I think individuals are favorable to those discussions and looking that direction.
Well, it's tough when you have a share price,
Yeah.
right? And that's some people, the only thing they look at. You have investors in your companies, and they look at the share price, and they don't read the details about where it's going or whatever. They just care about how that looks today, right? And there's so much more information about your company below that, under the surface of that. I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg, such as here's some, initiatives we're taking on in place to really tackle that, some of the challenges we have in here. And even a share price can be a really good one, but it can be an unhealthy one, like where you don't know. Some point, I found it crazy with the Columbia gas, where it was like scorched earth for a bit, and that was someone there that was, not maintaining the system, and bad things come by, they weren't quite available there to address the issues, right? And so that's to me, the share price is, a lot of people look at that share price, but sometimes those investors need to look at the write-ups and how healthy the company is doing and what initiatives and how are they serving the 30 stakeholders that this industry has. This is a really unique industry with how many people that it actually touches, whether it's homeowners or basic general public to planners, SUE and excavators, insurance companies. It's massive. So it's very unique. And, circling back with the 811, it's like we're all in it together. Like, that's never more true. Damage is a shared responsibility, right? And there's so much more we can do beyond that. It's just going to take years and years of getting some of the changing of the guards. And what happens, sadly, is if your share price is good and stuff, and then you're not doing the right things, and then the share price plummets, right? And that's a today thing. That's not always a planning for the 5 years down the road, so forth. So definitely changing that mindset a little bit would help out.
So, great discussion. Back to the original question. I'm curious, again, I'm going to ask Kyle because he's the only operator on there. And the rest of you, feel free to chime in. But Kyle, how do you think operators, plant owners would, in general, respond to the idea that, hey, these 811 call centers that were primarily set up for, the public utility damage prevention are going to use their technology and resources to distribute other types of damage prevention activities? How do you think, again, not specifically your company, I don't want any trade secrets, but generally the plant owners, operators would respond to that? Because you guys are the major payers, in some cases, the only payers into that system, right?
Yeah, right. It serves a purpose for us. It fits us, right? We know that we've got a solution to our issue. We work with, Texas 811. We know that we're getting our utilities notified on that, right? So it works for us right now, right? And I say it's a good approach. So, I think in that world, right, there's probably be a tough conversation, right, as we start having those conversations. What's the next, approach? How can we start getting those stakeholders? It'd probably be tough, right, to get more of us on board. Because there is an additional risk, right, to us sharing information or collecting information, whatever the case is. But I think when we look at the overall just damage prevention effort, right, in my world, the excavators always having challenges on private, locates, for example, or, the engineering survey requests. And, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to help move projects along, right? We should, at least in my opinion, as an operator or damage prevention professional, want to move that progress forward. So, I'm in favor of it, right? Having those discussions, at least at the beginning levels, because one of the frustrations I get on a regular basis from excavators mainly is, who do I call? It's slowing down projects. I'm having these conflicts. I don't know what to do, right? So they call 811. We get a conversation, right? And we try to say, well, here's how we can help you, or here's who you need to call. We don't know. So in that regard, it would be helpful, right? Because there's additional conversational layer of information that they can approach and utilize. And I want to help facilitate those conversations. So me speaking, I think I think there's opportunity there, and it will just help everybody, right? Damage prevention is a culture, is what it is. And it's folks and individuals knowing that, hey, I've got a solution, I've got a place where I can work with somebody else to solve my problem. And everybody, you know, they want to be successful with their project. They want to meet their timelines. And all these additional barriers, layers of conversation, and, you know, different platforms, and, you know, that creates those challenges. We want to help, you know, bridge those gaps. And this is a solution, in my opinion, or at least an opportunity to move in that direction.
I do think it'll take thinking outside of the box. Like right now we've got a ticket management system. It's very transactional. We've got a risk. We get someone to respond to that risk and identify exactly what it is. But we still have billions in damage every year across the country. CGA says 30, the emergency 811 said 60, but it's a big number. And the transactional system, or the way that we work today, might not be enough. And so I think it is a very interesting conversation to bring stakeholders together and say, well, what other elements do we need to add to how we're working today to make a system that starts really chipping away at that 60 or 30 billion? And that might take some investment, but, you know, net, we probably have a lot to invest as an industry.
I find with like the SUE side, you know, the utility working directly with the excavator, it's like, why do we need a middleman? Because, you know, my information's for my contractor that's providing it, and it's tough sometimes with some call centers. They're a little sticky, they're a little slow. Like I said, they're software developers. They're using a third-party service, and sometimes when there's issues and stuff, it could be slow down, and, you know, it's kind of a cost of them saying, hey, let's all go through it. Obviously, it's a good idea, same as getting everyone in. I mean, used to be a time where people would call the utility directly and they'd make 5 calls, you know. But how would you get past, you know, thinking that why do we need the middleman, and say for the greater good for that utility, you know, let's not just do it with that one excavator, but let's share it to a public source, right? Even if they put it online or something, you know, one calls or 811s could pull that into their essential systems, and it's not as much, but that efficiency of not having a middleman, I see it's almost like double-edged sword.
Yeah, I definitely think it's something to be very mindful of when, if there's no middleman in the process, who's the one that's controlling or capturing and documenting these situations. And so that's where I think back to the original question that we started with, having this to be an enhanced or augmented portion of the 811 process, bringing the stakeholders together allows the one call centers, 811 centers, to identify, if we approach this, where does that impact something else downstream or perhaps within the system? It's easy to say this will help serve one, but how does that impact the others? And as a community, we need to be having those conversations together. But it can be iterative. We don't have to wait for this huge moment of, okay, well, now everybody's pushed forward. We've started doing, you know, risk score analysis, providing those to certain customers and making that, you know, available to the locators so they can determine, wow, I need to take a better care in this situation because it's a higher number, or putting our URL on the maps, on the tickets themselves, to say, here's where the work's taking place, to those operators, to the locators, so they can see a physical, you know, version of the map versus the old school way of just looking at text and trying to decipher, I'm going from this intersection for this many feet. You know, it's like trying to describe, you know, a blind person where to go without having the direction or at least the physical ability to look at it. And so it's advancing that process, whether it's iteratively, but also keeping in mind all the stakeholders are going to be impacted, even by even minor change that could have huge implications on whether it's their resources, their system, their ability to manage those responses.
It's like, you know, when we talk about software, it's not always you go from 0 to 100%. You know, 100% is kind of a scary word sometimes. If you ask for uptime, someone, you know, you'll get a lot of 9s after the decimal, right? They'll never say the 100. And sometimes it's not about going from 0 to 100. It's about taking those iterative steps along the way and saying, hey, well, this is a little bit better. This will save a few times for whatever it is that the person is doing, right? And look, and if we take that first step, well, now we can look at taking that second step. And given that first step, even if it's regional, I think is a great idea to try and get things to start off, like we talked about the aerial stuff and getting more information in those data. And I'm sure you have some different mapping. I saw the, you know, how to set up your service areas and the maps, and there's different ways you can set up your maps at the call center too, right? And that information comes out differently. If I'm an excavator and I go in and I just see a service area, it don't really tell me much, right? Curious on that, like how do you find utility companies setting up their, you know, very specifically to where things are and here versus just setting up a service area?
You know, it varies. Some members have really good, tight data that they can narrow down where their center lines are within 25, 50 feet, if not less. And we have some that are buffered pretty wide, and that could be either for safety purposes, or it's just, that's where they believe their line to be within that time, that zone. And so it kind of challenging to try to bring, over 2,000 plus members to get all onto a very specific, center line, precision. And so the opportunity is, again, it's an investment. It will pay dividends in the long run, but it's going to take time to get there. But iteratively, we can, and we can work with them. But giving them the ability to do that on their own certainly provides a little bit more of a faster avenue if they wanted to pursue that. Likewise, for like you're saying, they can add attributes that may not be within the system today. But it also depends on what their focus wants to be. And if it's underground, that's where they're going to have their focus. If they want to pull in overhead, they can pull that in too. So it's, trying to get everybody on the same page when there's a lot of desires out there. And again, it's all in the interest of damage prevention, public safety. We are here to help facilitate that process.
All right, thank you, Scott. This is a great discussion. And I think we have time for one question. Does anyone have a question? Please feel free to come up or yell it out. And
Yeah, I got a question.
yes.
So y'all talked about centralizing the call centers, proprietary data aside. What are your plans for companies that might be hesitant to go along with this plan? What if they're like, it's my data, I don't want to share profits, I don't want to, whatever their issue is for being hesitant, what are your plans on enforcing the best way for everybody to have the same data?
I'm just going to quickly repeat it for maybe those on the stream who might not have heard that. So for the stakeholders, companies who might be hesitant about joining this kind of extension, sharing their data and whatever else, what are your plans, if any, to address that right now?
I think the free market would say, first, we got to get some early adopters in there. And they've got to have a really great experience. Then you see the middle follow, and then you work hard on the tail. And I think that can apply to this situation, but it's not a light switch where we turn it on one day and then suddenly everybody's in there sharing their information. But as the benefits present themselves, more will follow, because at heart, everybody we want to avoid infrastructure being damaged, and they want to avoid their infrastructure being damaged.
I mean, that's all good in theory, but sometimes you need some good old legislation to really drive something home, right? And say, look, if you don't do it, hey, here's what's going to happen, and it's going to cost you more if you don't, right? And so you'll see that, from statewide. It'd be nice to see something there, push nationwide to say, hey, you need to make sure that your data is up to date. If you look at some construction standards, and as well, you got to be sharing it. And sometimes that's just, they're not going to do it unless someone's dragging them, to do those things. And legislation can definitely help with that. So a lot of
All right, thank you. Sorry, we're running out of time. Can we get a hand for these fine panelists here? This, I think, been a very provocative, thought-provoking, by design discussion, and thanks to everyone for coming. The next session is at 2:30 p.m. Central Time, again, for those on the stream. Thanks again for everyone for coming. Thank you.
We have a shortfall at Q3, and it was a fiber damage that caused me to realize what our shortfall was. So we hit a fiber line. 48 strand fiber wasn't marked. So I personally went on the site. This is about a year ago. I got on the site, and foreman on site, 20-year foreman, veteran in the industry, crew pretty well trained. Foreman does not have damages, steady, does a good job. So when I looked at where he had the fiber cut in the hole, and he said, I don't understand where it comes from. I said, well, it comes down this pole over here, it goes over here. And he said, it goes in that pad. I said, no, that's coax pad. It goes down further into a hand hole. And I said, where's everything else that comes down? Here's three-phase, here's this, and we're figuring it all out. And he looked at me and he said, how do you know that? And I said, well, it's fiber on the pole. That's what that is. I know that because I've dealt with it for years. He said, I don't know that. And then his crew, once he started, his crew looked at me and he said, John, why don't you guys teach us this? I don't know that's a coax pad. I assumed the fiber went in there. So truly, I drove away from that site thinking to myself, we have to do a better job. This is a 20-year foreman in the field that's installed gas for 20 years, but did not understand everything he was looking at in the field. Our locators understand it all day long. We now have a process in place to train our foremen and train our underground crews by the locators how to identify these things. Things have changed in the field over time. Now, that's an excavator for 20 years in the business. If you were a local contractor and you were digging, how would you know? How would you know that's fiber coming down that pole? How would you look around and know what's going on around you if to notice something that's not marked? So to go back to the question, how do you prevent it? Technology can help, but that's some plain old education.
John's company isn't the only one with the same problem, and he works for a large, very successful utility contractor. Imagine all the smaller contractors that are never provided education other than what a veteran on the job site tells them. Yes, the best way to learn is from experience, and that's guaranteed to happen if you're an excavator.
Just general construction sites, and they hire us to come in and locate utilities so they can continue with their construction projects safely, so we don't hurt any of the infrastructure. A lot of times the true challenges are on what we find in the hole that nobody knew was there. A lot of times they'll
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Roundtable at the Texas A11 Damage Prevention Summit. And welcome to those who are streaming this over the web. My name is Jimmy Wang with BizMetrics. First thing, we'd like to have the panelists introduce themselves, please. Let's start with Dale.
Dale Berryman, VVAX Metrotech, Area Manager.
Mike Lenzinski, President, Bernstein International.
Adam Yunker, GPRS. I lead sales for the Eastern U.S. at our company.
Mike Martin, I'm the president of C-SCAN.
Thank you. We're going to start with the roundtable, and then about midway through, we'll have an opportunity for those in the audience to come up and ask any questions if you have them. So the topic or question at hand right now is damage prevention a public safety issue or a business P&L issue? So someone feel free to jump in.
Jamie, that's a good question. I think to answer that question, you need to look at who is the ultimate customer of damage prevention industry, right? And ultimately, that's the consumer in the United States. They're the ones utilizing water, utilizing gas. When we hit that water line, that local family restaurant down the road can't serve their customers that evening. And so to answer it, yeah, it's a public safety issue. We a lot of times go straight to the injuries and near misses there, but every single day, if we lose gas, we lose power, we lose water, everyday consumers are put out as a result.
And practically speaking, it's clearly both. It's a public safety issue. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But also, it's a business, so there's always a P&L somewhere. Somebody has to operate as a business to turn a profit.
Yeah, and the same thing. It's got to be, there's plenty of reasons why we should do things as a public safety, it's a public good. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons that we don't do it is because the numbers don't match. We're not making the company's not making the profit. The ROI can't justify it. So we sometimes sacrifice the best customer, the public safety customer, because of the profit incentive. So we have to work both.
Yeah, I also think that private locating or private property is an issue. A lot of lines that I see get hit on private property because they don't go and locate them. So they're not being prevented.
So I'd like to go back to Mike Klonsinski here. You said at the end of the day, it's a business, right? And the business has to stay in business, it has to make money. So sometimes, you didn't say this, but I'm going to paraphrase, sometimes the safety may not be as prominent as it should be. Is there anything we can do to maybe put our finger on the scale a little bit in terms of the public safety?
Well, a lot of that's beyond the pay grade of what I would have. It becomes a lot of legislative issues, public officials wanting to make the investment, make the commitment to go ahead and do that. Individually, we can't do too much on putting our finger on the scale. What we can do is advocate for some of the public officials to weigh that more heavily. But it is this constant challenge. The primary beneficiaries are not the ones that are paying the cost a lot of times. And when there's that disconnect, we end up in a situation where we're at today, where sometimes we're sacrificing what we could be doing in public safety better because it doesn't make the numbers work.
I think there's another opportunity. You can put your finger on the scale by trying to make the cost of damage prevention less. So you can make it more profitable by trying to improve the way we do it. If we keep doing the same practices over and over, we sort of asymptotically approach zero damages and having a perfect track record. But you have to innovate new processes and come up with better and cheaper ways of doing things, getting more out of less.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the dichotomy we're talking about here, and Mike, you originally brought it up, it's both, right? Is a lot of times because the ultimate consumer, or the customer is the consumer as we discussed, but they're also not the ones footing the bill for all of the individual organizations that work in the space, right? So each person has their own directive, and like you said, everybody's in business to stay in business, right? And you can't do that for free. And so that's where the dichotomy becomes, because certain folks are paying the bill for you to stay in business, and you're serving that customer, but ultimately we are serving the consumers as a whole, as a group, as a team, as we've been talking about a lot this week.
Right. So I think ultimately all these public safety issues have to have a P&L component, right? And an example I give sometimes is, why don't we have guardrails on the side of all of our highways, right? If we had guardrails on the side of all of our highways, it would be safer. It would prevent some deaths, for sure, guaranteed. But we don't have it because the expense of doing so would outweigh the lives saved. And by that, I mean, if we spent $100 billion doing that, and we wanted to save lives, we could have spent $100 billion on something else that would save even more lives. So are we at a point in this industry, damage prevention industry, where maybe we're at, if we're not willing to spend more money, invest more money, maybe we're at peak damage prevention? Is that such a thing here?
I think that was exactly the point that I was making before. You could put guardrails on every inch of road, but the ROI isn't going to be there. You hit diminishing returns on safety, but maybe there's a better way to prevent cars from running off the road than guardrails. Maybe the self-driving cars are part of the answer. Maybe there's another technology to develop that's going to solve the problem in a better or less expensive way.
Yeah, it is interesting when you get into these different incentives. I've heard a couple of the roundtables earlier today about how we should be doing things different, sharing information, centralized database, all this stuff to make things better. Well, the fact is that's happening in a lot of other industries. I mean, you can look at Salesforce, Uber, Google. There's plenty of organizations, Amazon, that are doing things with benchmarks that are well beyond what we're accepting in damage prevention. Uber wouldn't accept near the rate of injury in their business, and they do extreme volumes, that we do in our business. Amazon wouldn't have, or we wouldn't, as consumers, accept the delays in responses. We're used to that as consumers, but in our industry, our benchmark is, 6 days, 7 days, whatever that's going to be. Somehow, we don't apply the same benchmarks, and some of that comes from, they can make a lot of money doing it well, but we don't apply the same benchmarks in this industry that we expect in others.
Yeah, I wonder if we're even shooting at the right targets. We like to talk about getting to zero damages, but is that realistic? Is that really where we should be aiming? Amazon, you mentioned Amazon, and they sort of revolutionized being able to get a product in 2 days, 2-day prime shipping. Before they did that, that wasn't the expectation. So you have to move the goalposts. Like I was saying earlier, you tend to asymptotically approach your goal. You get diminishing returns at some point, no matter how much you put in. And maybe we can't do damage prevention harder. We have to do it smarter.
Yeah, and I'm risk of jumping into one more. A long time ago, when I was a futurist presentation, had said, if you want to get better in your industry, don't benchmark against your other industry people. Go to somebody that's the best in a different industry. Go to, when everybody in the industry I was in before in manufacturing was bragging about customer service, turned out Disney revolutionized what customer service was. And there's plenty of examples like that. And I think we should be doing that in the underground prevention world. We should stop benchmarking against what's been in the past. Like you said, the goalposts are different. And let's benchmark against what another industry is doing very well.
I know what I see is we show up on a lot of locates and they're already done. There are a lot of laws out there that can prevent this, but they're not being implemented. They're not being addressed. People are just digging wherever they want. I had a contractor in my backyard hit my gas line and my sewer line in about 20 minutes. I mean, I don't think there's anything being done. They just keep doing it over and over until somebody gets hurt.
It's another aspect of the P&L thinking. And even somebody getting hurt doesn't necessarily prevent that because it's managing risk. And there's a reason I'm not wearing a helmet right now. The likelihood of me falling down and hitting my head's pretty small. So maybe I think, well, I'm going to dig a hole here, and the likely outcome of that. And maybe I can estimate that outcome well, maybe I can't, but people think they can. And that's kind of why they do what they do.
I mean, we hear it's easier just to hit it than it is to go around it.
Exactly.
Until somebody gets seriously hurt, then it'll change everything.
Exactly, and that's exactly the problem. It's easier. So how do we make damage prevention easier than not damage prevention?
I think that's a great point, Mike Martin, is you made a couple points, which is maybe instead of the guardrails, it's something technological that's more scalable and less expensive. Maybe it's the technology that some cars have now of, when you start to swerve outside your lane, it beeps, or the steering wheel vibrates or something. So instead of saying, hey, inside the box idea, we got to build more guardrails, more miles of guardrails, right? And the second is the easier part, right? Maybe it's got to be easier for people. So sometimes the analogy I give is, how many people in this room, when you're mowing your lawn, you wear safety goggles, right? Probably no one, right? But your lawnmower goes over, ironically, a locating flag or something, right? Could come out, fly, blind you. Yeah, we don't do it. So what are your thoughts on like the outside the box, technologically centric solutions, and how do we make it easier for everyone?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And if we go with the guardrail metaphor, when they're installing the guardrails, they use leading indicators or historical indicators to determine where those guardrails go, right? Where are our most critical highest risk areas, somebody going off the road. There are a lot of technologies right now that folks are starting to use and build case studies for where, hey, where are most of our damages happening, right? Maybe they're critical areas where we've just got a very diverse set of utilities in the space, and it's just difficult to navigate those when you're installing new utilities, right? And so they're trying to use that data in order to inform their educational purposes later, right? So, hey, we know we need to target anybody working in this space because there's a high chance of damage, and it's less about their practices and more about the history of what we've seen in that area. And I think taking best practices like that, the sharing of utility data, mapping data, those types of things are really what can help improve, not just to your point, work harder to have less damages, but use technology to lever our efficiencies and get better as a group of partners.
So what are the things that are getting in the way of leveraging that technology? And even the guardrail analogy, I'm a little worried about us keeping going down that way, because pretty soon we'll be redesigning highways. But one answer would be get rid of all guardrails if you have self-driving cars that never get to the edge of the road. If we all had confidence in that, you wouldn't have to spend any money on guardrails at all. So what's the equivalent in our industry of a technology that we can get adapting where maybe we don't need, again, sort of in a past life, the quality control efforts. And when you eliminate the risk or you change the process at the front. And it feels to me like we've got a lot of, maybe to your point, rule laws or other things that are incenting the wrong things. That are actually getting in the way of ourselves. But now, like, the three of you can tell me how to fix that. I don't know.
Well, it's a good point. The technology, a lot of the technology already exists, right? We have GPS applications where we can collect data. We have mapping platforms where we can share data. We have a lot of systems that are collecting damage data, whether it be the dirt report or other platforms that are actually storing the location data of those damages. And so at this point, it just becomes, okay, how do we work those processes into the existing system, the 800-pound gorilla of damage prevention as it moves, right, and as it's legislated? And then the other question is, how do you get buy-in from all the stakeholders, right? And I think those are just the kind of geopolitical items that we can work through as different teams to get to the ultimate solution of working them into our processes.
Yeah, with what we do, we can actually collect information, locate information, and we can look at it in an office while they're doing it to see what the most likely mislocates are going to be by the data that we're given. But what I see a lot of times is the wrong people are analyzing it. And so I don't think anybody has a real infrastructure for that. It's a big deal to be able to see where your potential damages are going to be before they happen. That would be true prevention.
So to follow up on that, Dale, you said something interesting. You often see the wrong people analyzing that data as someone's locating live.
Well, if you have somebody who's experienced in locating, for example, and somebody looking at the data they collected that doesn't know locating, we have certain things in there that you should look at. For example, we could tell you what frequency might work the best in a certain ambient environment. Meaning if somebody shows up at the locate at the same time, they could be all using the same frequency, which confuses everyone. The problem is this device will tell you, use this frequency, but because of soil conditions, you have to use a different frequency. And then that person that's analyzing will say, well, there's where you made your mistake, and that's not true.
So do we have to have, and I'm just throwing this out there, do we have to have a person, right or wrong person, analyzing it, or can we use AI to analyze it, right? You're collecting this data as the locator's locating, and you have this wealth of data that's coming through. And because the humans analyze, then you have two people locating essentially, right? You got one person locating, one person analyzing. Is it possible to have one person locating, the wealth of data comes in real time, and AI analyzes it and then has exception reports or something?
Well, if I understand your question, you're saying if the person locates, can someone else look at it in real time?
Someone else or AI or something look at it in real time and red flags it for the locator if there's greater than 80% probability that there's an error
I think
some consequence.
I mean, pretty clearly, I mean, that's the case, right? AI is just an algorithmic way of approaching data using machine, right? It's a term that we use, has a lot of different meanings, but it's at its heart just an algorithm, right? So you design an algorithm to study data. If the algorithm has enough inputs to it, it can make reasonable conclusions about what's likely to happen. And it works with a feedback loop. All good processes work with a feedback loop. You have to do something, you have to test. If it worked, then you make it better. If not, you move on to something else. So yeah, clearly you can make a computer be in the loop, figure out whether things are proceeding well, whether there's a high probability something's gone wrong. You can use machines at all sorts of different levels in this thing. Like the problem you were mentioning about frequencies and multiple locators using the same frequency in the same area. Why does that problem have to exist at all? Why can't we move technology past that?
Well, I think the reason might be because there's so many complications in locating, where you put a ground rod, the soil conditions that drive you to use a certain frequency. So if one shows up and wants to use this frequency, I guess you could have proprietary frequencies for each locator, but that would be a nightmare.
Well, what if they were networked? What if they were networked and they couldn't operate in proximity to each other at the same frequency?
Well, what we do currently is before you hook up a locator, you just turn your receiver on and you sort of scope the area out that way to see if there's any frequencies being, because you can't see them, but they exist. But you could. But it seems like a lot of the people that I work with are all using the same frequencies. They're very similar to each other.
I think that's one of the ways that we've got a fallible human process in play here. So you've got a process that you have to follow. And part of the process is before you activate your transmitter, you look and you see, was there background interference at this frequency? But you're relying on the human to do this accurately.
That's right.
And then the human's going to go out, the human's going to designate a utility position. If you're trying to map something, the human is going to log data points. They're going to figure out where the utility positions are, and it's input into the system. So if you wanted to do, as Jimmy said, use an AI to help correct this, there's a lot more that you have to cover because you have a lot of human behavior to solve and understand.
And to add to that human behavior, a lot of people aren't trained properly to use a locator, that are out using locators every day. We spend a lot of time seeing people do it the wrong way for years. And maybe they're just lucky, that things didn't get hit.
Why are people not trained properly?
Well, I think it's a budget situation with a lot of entities. They can't afford to do it. Bob trains John, and Bob's not a teacher, right? He may be a good locator, but he can't put that information into someone else.
So I'm sorry, I have a follow-up question. By the way, if anyone has any questions, give me a second, let me ask this. We all have smartphones here in the room. How many people got formal training on their smartphone?
Well, I didn't. YouTube.
All right. So, and I'm just throwing it out there, Dale, maybe playing devil's advocate, people didn't, quote unquote, get the proper training, but is it the proper training or is it the interface or how the device can be used, right? Because none of us went in for proper quote unquote, proper training on our smartphone or whatever.
I don't think it's something you can learn from a smartphone. If you make mistakes with a smartphone, nobody gets hurt. You send people out there locating water lines and they put the blue on the what would be the gas line. People dig really different. They see it's blue, they dig really aggressively. If it's yellow, they take their time. So I think it's something that you have to have hands-on. It's sort of an art and a science all wrapped up into one.
It is, yeah. But I think there's a definition of terms as well. Like, what is proper training? What's proper in this case? Is more training better? Is there too much training? How do you know when it's enough? You can keep training, and there has to be a feedback loop at some point where if you're not creating damage, if you're accurately marking your utilities, then maybe that is proper training. Yeah. So it does come back to the original P&L question, and is there an ROI in more training? Because it's less expensive if fewer damages, but training also has a cost. So as long as that's the way you're approaching the problem, you're kind of always going to end up in a situation where people have maybe just barely enough training. Right. Because that's the way business is going to optimize it. So the other thing is, how do we make training less expensive? How do we make less training necessary? How do we make it a more intuitive, less art, potentially even less science? How do we build more of it into the way we're approaching the problem and less of it being dependent on human operators.
Maybe virtually you could do training, you know, set little landmines out there and pitfalls and mistakes and see how they react.
I think there's some companies out there doing that.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience here.
It's part comment, part question. I just want to make a disclaimer. It's me. I'm the individual speaking. I'm not representing my company, of course. So this is my experience as a locator in Texas. The training is all right, but at the same time, it is subpar. You know, you can go in the classroom, but you have to have a controller there making sure that the people aren't talking about football or bars or whatever. They got to stay on task, because that was subpar in my experience. The second thing was we need to divert more funds towards, and this is my opinion, of course. I'm not a business manager. I've not been, you know, I don't have the books. I'm not, you know, in the whatever. So we should be diverting more funds into the people in the field. And I don't mean give them more money. You can, that'd be great. But at the same time, give us our locators back. Give us good trucks. Give us paint. Why would we have a paint shortage, but you're making $1 billion a year? You know what I mean? Like, let's focus. This is just, again, for me and a bunch of locators out in Texas. It's not just me thinking this. Let's divert the funds into the people actually breaking their backs to get this stuff done. We can't catch up with the tickets because there's not enough people in the field. There's not enough people in the field because the experienced locators are quitting because of the shortage. And yet there's a shortage because people aren't trained enough and they're not fully aware of what they're doing when they step out onto the field as a beginner. And there's not enough people staying in the field getting their support. You know, a good locator should get support. And if they don't, they're gonna go somewhere else or change industries altogether. And you see that happening right now. There's a shortage of locators for reasons like this. Again, it's my opinion, it's my point of view. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not. You know, that's a majority of us out there in the field, you know, thinking this kind of stuff. And without hearing y'all's thoughts, we just have to come up with our own opinions.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think you're right. And then in some ways, and we're facing the shortages in some of our businesses in supporting the surveying industry. Surveyors are 66 years old on average. They're going, we're in a world where there are fewer people and higher requirements, and we're going to need to, we just can't keep scaling the people. They're just not there. So I think this topic, though, is around, there are a lot of innovative things and technologies and investments, and there should be investments in the locators as well. But there are investments that we should be making in technology and systems changes that would make life a lot easier for everybody going forward. And it's happening in other industries, it's just not happening in ours. So what are those and how can we get rid of those barriers? I would say, so for example, we experimented, we looked at things like, why do we have to have multiple technologies for identifying different utilities? Can we get to a utility agnostic locating world? Can we get to easy share data across cloud to cloud type systems? Can we do things like easier system integration? It's happening in other places. It's just not happening here with us. And a lot of that's some of those regulatory barriers that you talked about. Some of it's the old way of thinking. Some of it's money. So, I don't know,
is this great discussion, but back to the original topic, the public safety versus P&L issue, is part of that imbalance, if you will, because when there is a damage or when there is a disruption in service in our infrastructure, the full cost of that, the cost to society, the cost to emergency services, et cetera, are not fully captured in the restoration cost, in the direct restoration costs. So if CGA, and I should know this, shame on me, but something like for every $1 of direct repair costs, there's like $30 of other costs. So maybe if those costs were factored into the repair restoration costs, the scale or the equation would look very differently. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you can change things around a little bit by looking at it that way, because right now those costs are real, but they're spread out, they're dispersed. So, and I think this actually does relate to the previous question about training and why we don't spend more money on that, is because the industry is designed to do just good enough, right? We do approach damage prevention from a lowest cost point of view. We do the utility locating through the lowest price bid in a lot of cases, and that's going to produce a result that's just good enough. So nothing's ever going to be great. And so if you were to shift the costs around, the way the costs are borne for a damage, so the liability shifts, and you're liable for lost productivity in the businesses that get shut down when you cut a fiber optic line, then yeah, that will change the amount of attention that people put into that aspect of it. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it would cause something to be different.
Yeah, it's a classic public good issue. It's just that you're shifting the cost to somebody that may or may not be recognizing the benefit at that. And
But they'll change their behavior if you.
They will. People will change their behaviors.
I don't know if we come out better or worse from that.
Right.
All right, thank you. So the follow-up question, related question is, there may be as many as 400 million locates of public utilities a year in the U.S. With the GIS data for those 400 million almost never collected, right? Is there an opportunity here to collect that data and use it in some way to help improve damage prevention?
Kind of a duh answer, yeah. Yes, if we could collect 400 million points of data and have that available to be accessed in some type of GIS or the asset management systems or others, undoubtedly we'd be better. The trick is how to make that happen.
Yeah, the NUAR, so for those that may not know, the EU does their damage prevention process a little bit differently than us, but the NUAR is the National Underground Asset Registry that they contain over there. And essentially that's all the utility operators, owners publishing all their utility data to this one platform that's then shared to excavators and locators before projects. And they estimated about a 30-to-1 ROI improvement on their damage prevention processes and reportings after implementing this process, just for folks having a map. Just being able to use that data to know what's in the ground ahead of time and prevent damages. And so I think we can do that. I know in the private space, I come from a little bit different experience. We've been doing this for a while. We share our mapping data with our customers, with their customers, anybody that may be digging in the same space as our project. And we're seeing a reduction in damages. We're seeing customers, operators use this information to share to all their other contractors in the area, because ultimately their goal is, hey, I don't want my pipe broken, right? And if anybody's putting a bucket in the ground, I want them to know what's there. And so we see a lot of success from that. There are certainly challenges to implementing that nationally in a program as large as the 811 system that we have here. But ultimately, a lot of folks are seeing positive ROI on it that have done it elsewhere, and I would love to see some movement that direction here as well.
Yeah, I think providing a map seems like a pretty straightforward way of increasing the flow of information, and that's going to have a good benefit on damage prevention.
Yeah, in our industry, we work with a lot of as-built maps, and they're okay. They give you some information. It's like a puzzle. You can't get a picture without all the pieces. So it is a piece, but we're also seeing a lot more GPS mapping with utility locators. That's really gotten very popular over the last 24 months. And those coordinates, once you obtain them, if they're done correctly, which is the main thing, you can reuse them for relocates. And you don't have to hook up a transmitter, and that gets rid of the frequency problems and the soil problems. I wouldn't suggest not using tracer wires or markers that are going in the ground. I'd utilize them all, but I'd also drop coordinates on the lines too, as they're put in.
We just completed part of a 7-year study with the Staking University people about using GIS. We put markers in the ground, mapped, took a photo, left. Came back 7 years later and had people go find and locate them. and fast, very quickly, very fast, very easy. So we know it can be done, but it has to be from the start as well, like you said.
We don't make marker systems, but we make devices that locate them, and it's a real challenge to get almost any utility to actually use them.
Right.
That's the bit, they just don't want to spend the money. You know, we say, well, how much does it cost a foot to put that in? It's pennies compared to dropping a marker in the ground, but they just won't do it. Maybe there needs to be some sort of, anything that goes in the ground, in my opinion, should be mandatory to be locatable.
Mapped and marked.
Yeah, that's the way it should be.
Yeah, I think, if we look at how the kind of conversation shifted over the years, there used to be a lot of talk about, could we map? Is it something we could do? Is it something we should do? Now it's just happening. It's starting to happen. It's becoming all about the implementation details. Exactly how does it work? How do we share the maps once we have them? So the conversations, I think, reflects the inertia that's building.
Yeah, some of the culture change that I think will happen over time is a culture of data ownership to a culture of data sharing, right? We realize in best practices and with experience over time that the more information I share with the other stakeholders working in the space that I'm in, the more we're all more successful with less damages, less injuries, et cetera. And I think as that culture shifts, because we're already seeing it now, I think we'll see more success from a mapping perspective.
I think it's a good idea to do that, because a lot of times when lines are put in the ground, they're locatable for 10 years. And then because of congestion, soil conditions, we can't locate those lines 10 years later without locating something else that we don't want to locate. So having a GIS location would really be very, very important to our industry.
So if the ROI, return on investment, is so compelling for markers or whatever else, and I'm assuming your companies have proven that out to your clients and potential clients, why aren't those things used more? I mean, if it's so obvious, if it's like a no-brainer from a financial perspective.
Well, I think you still have the issue, maybe Dale, they know that everybody knows marking and mapping is the right thing, but it costs more. So the benefits accrued for me spending the extra amount to go ahead and mark something while I'm mapping it may not make the ROI number. The overall ROI is still good, but it doesn't accrue back to me.
I think we'll be able to develop technologies that address that. We'll be able to make it actually cheaper to even mark and map at the same time. Be able to improve the overall efficiency of even the marking process while still producing good maps at the same time.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Takes time.
So is part of that, Mike Martin, shortening the time horizon for the R of the ROI? So instead of, I think what Mike Klonsinski is saying is the R takes too long, 7 years, 10 years for me, the decision maker, to make the I to realize the benefits of the R. So are you saying you can work on technology that shortens the enjoyment of the R?
Exactly, yeah. We improve the overall process immediately. It doesn't have to be something that takes more time in order to see a benefit from it.
I think when you're working in complex spaces too, the person investing is not always the person that's seeing that improvement in ROI, right? When you're putting, let's use tracer wire, that's highly used right now, right? A lot of folks that invest in tracer wire, it does save their damage later, but ultimately that cost if someone breaks that line at a later date lands on somebody else, right? And so they know, hey, if I am putting this tracer wire in with my new fiber line, ultimately, yeah, I'm not going to potentially lose data at some point, but it's going to save somebody else down the road from damaging that utility. And that's the person whose shoulders the damage cost would fall on, right? And so a lot of times the investment from a group of stakeholders or a specific stakeholder may not see that ROI in their budget, but in the industry in general is a positive ROI.
Right. So, Adam, you said something interesting about the culture of data ownership to culture of data sharing. And our society has transitioned more and more from, like, I have to own something in order to use it, to maybe I don't. Maybe I just rent it. Maybe I borrow it. So we all use like Uber or Airbnb or whatever. Have we made moves, has this industry made moves down that path? And if not, what do you think will trigger that?
So just to clarify, you're asking if this industry has made moves towards data sharing?
Towards data sharing, as it seems like a lot of society has in other aspects, right? With Airbnb, with Uber, with, I don't own the vacation home. I don't own this car, right? Someone's giving me a ride, right? Are we making progress? This industry, are we making progress down that path, or are we still like in the infancy of accepting that maybe I don't need to own all the data, so to speak, and I could share it, or I could buy it sometimes, or I could sell it sometimes?
Yeah, so I think back to when I first started coming to Common Ground Alliance events and damage prevention events like this one, and talking about maps of utilities, of all utilities, not just a specific type of utility, and sending that information to other folks was a bit taboo, right? And over the last couple of years, I mean, now we're having a roundtable talking about how can we do it, right? So I think absolutely the culture is changing from, hey, I need to own my data, I need to keep it safe, to, hey, how can I use or share my data to help everybody become more safe, right? I would say, yeah, we're moving that direction.
It sounds good, but I tell you, I see a lot of reluctance to sharing that information. Not from me, but from the utility. We send stuff to our cloud, and a lot of times they don't want to go in there. So they're very protective over their maps.
Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of early adopters once people start to see best practices and a lot of a positive impact of that. You're gonna start to bring in a lot more folks. There's probably always going to be those folks that want to keep their data because it's proprietary or it's their competitive advantage over their competition, and you may always struggle to get those folks to buy in. But I think at a high level, I think you're seeing the industry in general move in the right direction.
And I think the industry is realizing there's middle grounds to data sharing too. It's not like you have to open up the whole audit trail of that pipe that almost broke and killed a bunch of people. You don't have to make that public, but there are things that you can have limited amounts of data, who the asset owner is, asset description, the lat long, maybe a serial number on that, and that can be easily shared and mapped between without sending the lawyers into a frenzy at each of the utilities. And it happens all the time now with the GIS. You can have limited access rights to certain amounts of data. As I said, we've been looking at even eliminating sort of the human proposition in some cases with RFID as a serial number on the assets connected directly to the GIS, so we can read. There's no human error transmission issues, and it's connected to the GIS, so you can launch all the data and inspection forms that are secure, that are appropriate to that asset.
Do you collect that lat long with that too?
Yes.
That's good.
I think things don't change overnight, but inertia is building, and even the people that are reluctant to share data now, they'll more and more be outliers, and sooner or later, I think they'll get with the program.
So, Dale, you mentioned there's a lot of reluctance, and we don't need to mention any company names, but there's a lot of reluctance regarding sharing data. What's the basis of that reluctance? Is it mostly?
I think most of it's just a cultural thing. That's what they've always done, and they're just reluctant that way. And sometimes you just need some change. But I agree with these fellows here. I think it is changing, but there is a huge reluctance. As I said, we send a lot of stuff to our cloud, and half the customers don't want to go in there because they feel that they're not in control of it, that somebody else is. Even though there's a lot of laws that prevent us from sharing that information, they're still very reluctant, and major utilities. So, but it is changing, I think. I think in our industry, the GPS lat long is probably the biggest thing that I've seen increase over the years.
What do you think would be the trigger point for pushing these companies that are reluctant kind of over the line to making them feel comfortable enough to share that data? I mean, can you envision something that might happen to kind of push them over the threshold?
I know in California they are having some, by 2023 they have to start using lat long But they still have that reluctance, they're gonna keep it for themselves. And I don't know how you get around that unless you pass some sort of assembly bill or something like that that requires it. Because I do think it will save lives, I really do.
Do we have to look at it as being their information in the first place?
Well, they own it.
No, they don't.
In the right of ways, they don't.
Depends who's
It
collecting.
could be who is.
Right, it depends, right? I mean, information is hard to own. You know, it's whoever creates it, whoever possesses it may own it, but does it actually really belong to the utilities?
You know, there's some actually relatively simple on its face type things. If there was a law that was passed that said, yeah, any utility placed in a right of way has to be mapped and marked, and you got to turn it over the mapping in a shapefile to
Yeah, a
to
lot
the
of
authorities.
DOTs are doing this.
And if we had that nationally, you're already setting the stage then for everything being mapped and marked going forward in the country. Now, that I can sit up here and say that's a simple thing to do, but you know, one sentence in a law in each state that said that would change everything in a hurry.
I have a few more questions, but before I go down that path, are there any questions from the audience here? Yes, please. You want you to shout it out and I'll repeat. Well, yeah, come.
What's going on, guys? Y'all talked earlier about contractors hitting your gas and sewage lines within like 20 minutes of one another. Me and my partner here, we're both journeyman linemen who also do locates kind of on the side. We're getting into it. But I was just wondering, like, in doing that, is there a better way, like those contractors, that could we communicate and educate and possibly, we're talking about sharing data and stuff, how is it that y'all's industry, how can we both, you know, create a better relationship with one another where maybe it's not a law passed, a bill passed, how can we, you know, make it more of I guess a friendship kind of deal? I mean, could you guys come in maybe once a quarter? Because I feel like since pre-COVID, maybe we haven't met up with you guys. We had a convention, and they sent me and Matt down here today or yesterday. How can we build a relationship where it doesn't feel like y'all and us, but more of a conglomerate group? You know, y'all are buddies. We don't want to hurt nobody. We want safety to be prioritized.
So I'm going to summarize for those on the streaming, on the stream. I think the question is how can thank you. How can the stakeholders work more collaboratively versus maybe confrontationally?
Well, first off, I'm from the state of Florida, and right now we've got a lot of linemen over there helping get us back up and running. So thank you for what you guys do out there. As far as answering your question, I do think it comes down to relationships, right? If I'm an excavator and I call in a ticket and I don't know that the locator has 45 locates on his day listed that he hasn't even gotten to, and it's 5 p.m. and I'm calling him saying, "What the heck, man? What's going on?" I mean, that's not building a positive relationship. So I think each stakeholder has to be proactive in their relationship building. Yeah, there's a system, there's a process, it's legislated what's required, but at the end of the day, everybody's a person, right? And everybody has different challenges that they're facing, different obstacles. And if you reach out and be proactive about solving problems together or preventing problems together, I think that's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think you guys are right. I just don't know that could happen in the field. It has to happen upper management. You know, that's where it's got to come from. The field people are a lot like this gentleman, where they want to work, but upper management says no. You know? And I don't think we could solve that from this table.
Okay. Last question. Mike Martin brought up almost a philosophical point here, which is, does the data, the underground data, does that really belong to the utilities? Okay. And I thought that was a really interesting question. Like, you're running your facilities under public property, on the easements, sometimes on private property, and then you quote unquote own that data. Wait, does that make sense? Or have we accepted that as making sense because that's the way it's always been? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I know when we're contracting with customers, a lot of times that's spelled out in the contract, right? Any photos you take on site, any data you collect is our data. We technically own that. And if we execute that contract, that's what we're agreeing to. In a lot of situations, the stakeholder collecting the data isn't working for the person that owns the utility underneath. And in that case, from what I see, there's no contractual obligation that operator owns that data. It would be the person collecting that data in that moment.
Yeah, I think the ownership depends on how the data was collected and what the details of any contract that was in place to do that is. If I, get out a sheet of paper and I sketch the location of the utilities that are in the street in front of my house, it's not even on my property. Does the utility own that map that I just created?
No, but I would think if they're paying you to collect that data, that might be different.
Sure, it depends on the terms of the
And that's
contract.
what's happening is they're
Right.
paying people to do this. And a lot of the utility locators work for that company and they're made not to give it out to anyone. Just put marks on the ground.
Right.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Can we get a round of applause for the panelists? Thanks to everyone in the audience. Thanks to everyone who's streaming online. And if you hang around for
Now we
8
gotta
minutes,
take
I
all
think
this.
next one's starting. Thank you.
Do you believe that the current one-call model as adopted by the United States is an effective and practical one?
No.
There's an opportunity for one call for 811 to be much more than we are today, but there are some barriers in place today that make that harder to get to. So we could say that some of that is the law, some of that is the disconnect between the different stakeholders, some of that is just lack of knowledge that there's another opportunity out there to pursue. And it really just takes getting together in a room with people who have a similar objective and then hashing out what success looks like around that.
The system's broken.
Sucks to be you, we already got all these customers.
But you are the problem.
It should be mandatory.
You never say never and you never say impossible.
what's going to be really good about this learning management system and the use and the way we use video, the way we use drone footage, GoPro footage, multiple camera angles. It's going to be very different than just learning it in a classroom. The hope is that you can go back and watch all this stuff multiple times if need be, so it'll help you retain the information. It'll give you really more than a hands-on experience actually when you're watching this through video.
That's where this video training kind of gets a little better than the hands-on training in some aspect, because while you can sit in a classroom and explain how signal comes out and how it works and the science of it, we can actually show graphics and animate, how the fields come off the line and how the signal repels out and comes back in, and other information that's happening during the locate through video.
If you were to complete the training material and then come out here and locate them yourselves, they would be exactly where you saw them in the videos. But the program's also good for people who aren't in the field but are, say, still in the industry. I mean, there are other training programs out there for people to use, but in terms of something like that we've produced here, no one's ever done that before.
I think to somehow come up with some kind of certification license program where these guys can look at it as a career, as a plumber would, as an electrician would.
You create a career ladder then, effectively.
Yes.
You've got to,
Right.
you've got to wait.
Here's your entry into the one-call industry with just a certification, a license that says, I'm licensed to use an EM locating machine.
Yeah, exactly. I think that really gives someone a career path that makes it a whole lot more enticing to come into the industry, because if you're looking at it as it stands right now, some people might go, well, do I want to do that? What is my progression possibilities? Is it seasonal? How long will I be able to do this? How can I progress? How can I create a career path for myself? And if you do have that facility in place, you've got a path of progression, then people are going to be intrigued and want to be part of the industry, because you can clearly see, well, I can do this, then I can reach that level and that level and that level, yes. And you've got a career built for yourself.
It would help to reduce some of the stigma that seems to be attached with the locator as well. I know some of our customers, in the summertime when digging season is peaking, they have kids that are looking for jobs, in high school or in college, and their summer job is to tag along with a locator and help with maybe the locator would actually trace out the line and then paint it, and then their helper would come and install the flags down the line or something, and that just kind of gives off the presence that it's just it's a grunt job, if you will, when in fact it's really not. It's a very important part of all of this. One of the big parts is accurately locating everything, preventing damages, preventing injuries. So it's to put a certification value onto it, just to raise the value of that career as a whole, I think would be a really great thing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Roundtable at Texas 811 Damage Prevention Summit. And welcome to those who are following us on streaming on the web. My name is Jimmy Wang with BizMetrics. And first, we're going to go around the panelists and have them introduce themselves.
My name is Ronnie Stovall. I'm the supervisor at Pipeview America.
Dave Mulcahy. I'm the Director of Business Development for Western United States with GPRS.
I'm Doug Kenyon. I'm with Stake Center Locating, and I help with business development.
I'm AJ Clark. I'm with Badger Locating Solutions.
All right, thank you, everyone. Just for the audience, about midway through, we're going to pause and take any questions you may have. And if you have a question, please come up and use the microphone here that I'm using. So the question we have at hand here is, how can we collect, analyze, and act upon damage statistics more effectively? So anyone feel free to start. All right, Doug, you start.
Thank you, Jimmy. Well, first of all, just can you repeat the question again? Was it specific to damage data?
Yeah, how can we collect, analyze, and act upon damage statistics, damage data, more effectively?
Right. Well, I would start with this. I think damage data is, by its very nature, a lagging indicator, right? Something has already happened. But I think there's a lot we can learn from damage data. It could be frequent offender. It could be high consequence areas, et cetera. So I think, I guess to lay the groundwork, I would suggest that data, first of all, you have to have data integrity, because we all know garbage in, garbage out, right? So focusing on the source of the data, consistency with the data source, analyzing the data, but then maybe most importantly, having actionable items on the data once you have the data. So that could be through education, could be through communication, could be through revised training procedures, for example, right, where we can maybe impact behaviors in the field, et cetera. So I would suggest that's a starting point.
I think you make a good point there, along with more analysis into root cause to that. I mean, you brought up the idea of, the damage is already too late. So why don't we do more analysis on the front end? And I know a lot of the data sets that I've seen, a lot of those root causes are left blank. We have no idea. I think that's the next deep dive to where we can start getting preventative compared to reactive and problem solving. Let's switch this to problem preventing by digging a little deeper on that damage data, not just saying, oh, we've collected it, this was damaged, this is maybe why it was damaged. Get down to that actual root cause, or maybe one or two root causes to associate with that.
Sure.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you guys said. I'd also add a couple of things, and one is that there's always a balance between having integrity of data or quality of data and ease of collection, right? There's always this challenge, right? Because if a person's out there, in reality, there's no accepted way to collect that data across the damage prevention industry. It doesn't exist. So in reality, what's going to happen is a person's going to take a couple pictures and take a couple notes. I mean, at a minimum, right? If there's no other structure in place. The other thing I'd like to say is that when I think about it, there's only really two causes. Number one, we didn't know where whatever was. And number two, we didn't excavate it in a safe way. I mean, if you really think about it, like those are your two, barring natural disasters, I guess. But in almost every case, there's your two problems. So if you want to just take a really, really high level look, you can be like, we're not good at knowing where it is, or we're not good at digging or hitting it.
I agree with that, but there's also several components within those, right? You open up one bucket, and all of a sudden there's 15 other buckets within. We didn't know where it was. Did we not know where it was because it was mislocated, or did we not know where it was because we never called in a ticket?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I'm just trying to get. We have to have a way to organize things.
Of course.
Yeah.
If there was a better system in place where we could give feedback when we find stuff that's been mislocated, we can, GPS it, mismark it, and give some kind of feedback to 811, or anything like that. That would be a very important tool out there. Because a lot of times when you find stuff that's mismarked, and if you can take pictures of it, get measurements and all that stuff, and GPS it, and then send it to somebody for feedback, then next time it might, you wouldn't have that problem. It's just I think they're not they're not going through or I wouldn't say they, but you know, is in general, we're not updating our system as much as we should.
So data collection.
Data collection.
Right. Systemized data collection, mandatory participation, right? I think that leans towards the data integrity, because if not everybody is participating in the data collection, the format of the data collection. I think CGA has done a great job of making strides towards systemizing that and trying to get some consistency in the data collection side. And I know there's a lot of activity, I think in general in the predictive analytics world as well, right? Where we can take data, learn from it, and leverage technology in terms of a predictive analytics and preventing damages from happening before they ever do happen.
There's a bit of this, I mean, to get down to the very bottom part, there's really no incentive to report a damage, right? When that damage happens, there's times where it's not that big a deal, we'll kick some dirt over it, let's keep on working here. So the data that we do have, I still think is fractional compared to what is actually happening out there in the industry.
Yeah, and to Ron's point about if there was like a discrepancy or mismark or something there's a loop that would go back to one call center and then go back to the operator. You know, I think if locators started to believe that when they hit mismark or when they, you know, or excavators or whomever is involved in this feedback loop, non-locatable or whatever, if they believed that change was happening and they saw the change happening, you know, then people start doing it. Then it's more of a movement.
Yeah,
where if it's just
it would create a movement for people doing it more often.
So that positive momentum, that's the big why or how. But I mean, we're not here to solve that problem, are we?
Well, no, I don't think so. So are you suggesting then regulatory involvement? In other words, you know, what gets measured gets done, right? I mean, if you have a speed limit and there's no police, then would you follow the speed limit, right? I mean, it's kind of that analogy, right?
You might follow the speed limit if you kept wrecking.
Right. Now that's a good point. Yeah, I think that there's a fear, a very necessary fear of damage. And you know, that's an interesting point too, because it used to be just the gas and the electric, the ones that could physically hurt you. But with today's communication infrastructure, there's more at stake today than there ever has been, right? Because people are working from home. Emergency services are all directly tied to connectivity and maintaining that infrastructure. So I think they're on the equal playing field anymore with electric and gas utilities as well.
Well, and then you start getting into the other utilities with cross-bore and all of that. Now you're cross-boring through sewer lines and people are flushing the toilet and it's coming back at them. So every utility now is heightened in its ability. Not just the gas and electric can hurt you. There's a lot that can hurt the budget, the wallet, and everything in between.
Yeah, there's an incentive there to prevent damage for sure.
Yes.
So, Doug, you said something that's interesting, which is damage data is lagging indicator. Are there leading indicators? And if not, or even if there are there ways to analyze these lagging indicators? And this is for everyone. Are there ways to analyze these lagging indicators, lagging data, and use it in a leading ways and proactive ways?
Sure, I think we are doing that inside of our organization as well others. And that's, I think it's the data that feeds the predictive analytics that are used in preventing damages, right? Some of those categories that we have suggested would be maybe from an excavator side, not picking on excavators, but a frequent offender, right? Maybe an excavator that's known to dig recklessly. And if you match that data with another data field would be a high consequence area, right? Where there's high profile or high consequence facilities, and you get those two together, that data could then score a 10 in terms of a risky ticket, if you will, right? So I think there are other indicators as well that we can learn in a damage investigation that we can leverage towards using that predictive analytics.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think just positional data alone, right? So for instance, you know, let's do a pipeline. If a pipeline is shallow, there's probably going to be more problems, right? Because they think it's typically deeper, right? That's a thing that happens a lot. If there's a gathering field, a lot of those there's no records and no maps for, right? And even things like buffer width, like does the width of the buffer affect, if you looked at it over the long term, you might be surprised. There might be a sweet spot of buffer width, you know what I mean? Stuff like that we haven't even really thought about because we haven't been able to collect the data to compare it to the metrics.
You can get into material of pipe. There's a lot of factors that you take. If we are properly collecting this damage investigation, this damage information, we can start collecting it and start saying, hey, we're seeing a lot more damages on plastic water lines. Well, yeah, because they're not locatable. We're going off of maps. And those maps that may not be as accurate as we said they were, what the utility provider was giving that locator. So again, back to the question of, yes, all of the post-mortem damage information can start getting put into something where we can start realizing, okay, more damage is happening in these situations. We need to highlight these when they come in because these could be high leverage or high damage probabilities.
Yeah, and I think if a lot of utility owners and, locate companies have some sort of system that, we try to figure it out, right? I think the next step there is compare notes. Get one utility owner to compare notes with another company, like, hey, are you having a problem with whatever, and I think maybe that's another thing that isn't done as well as it could be.
Yeah, those best demonstrated practices, they don't get shared across enemy lines all that often. We, in the industry right now, we rely heavily on, hey, CGA, post this thing so we have this data. It would be great if utility owners were communicating their data back and forth. Maybe locators were communicating that. Private and public were getting together with their best demonstrated performances.
Yeah, if they share just a little bit more data between other, companies, and that would help out a whole lot, because when you try to hold back, because you don't want somebody to know this or somebody to know that, that's, that creates problems in the long run, especially for excavators and, and locators. So I think the key word is share. Share your intel on, that plays a big part in it.
Yeah, we always look at it internally. If the 80, 90, 100,000 projects that we completed in a year, we look at any of those damages and we see this is how we can get better internally. But we never have looked at it as how can the industry get better off of these. And I'm guessing every company has that same approach. They're looking internally saying, okay, we can learn off of these 100 damages that took place this year and figure out how to not have those happen next year.
Yeah,
well, that's where I think the CGA does a great job, right? They bring all stakeholders to the table, and we have the opportunity to sit down and talk about it and share ideas and I think mostly get some actionable items when we get up from the table that we can all take back, right? And be influencers not only in our company but also in the industry as a whole. And so again, my hat's off to the CGA for being really the forerunner in that. Because who else is going to do it? State one call centers, I suppose that's one geographical repository of information where it could be done, right? But that's where I just have a ton of appreciation for the CGA and what they're doing and the efforts that they're making collectively, right?
So the CGA in the DIRT report, I think as you alluded to, Doug, does collect and try to identify duplicate submissions of the same damage, right? So there's some sharing of data, but the data is analyzed in aggregate, right, in an anonymous fashion. Is there a way that, the previous session was about sharing of locate data and stuff, but is there a way that damages data can be shared more by the various stakeholders? Because if there's a damage, there may be multiple investigations, right? The locating company, the excavator, and so on. How can that be shared more? And would it help with some of the proactive actions of predictive analytics or other things that the industry is starting to use more and more? How might that happen?
So I would say it is being shared a lot more than we think, because we live in an era of social media and camera phones. So at a field level, that information is being shared. Someone's taking a picture of it, someone's sending it to someone else, as much as you try to want to not believe that's true at a management level, it is. So whether we like it or not, it's being shared. A lot of it's maybe not being shared the way we'd like it to, a lot of it's anecdotal, but I think the challenge is getting that information that's likely already being collected and likely already being shared is to get it, to your point, integrity of data, and get it to where we use it to try to prevent future problems, right? I think that's something, I was just thinking about that, like actually it probably is being gathered and shared quite a bit, right? I mean, because you know how it is, if there's something that goes wrong, snap a picture and then there it goes, right?
I guess I'm interested, I don't actually know how the CGA gets all of their data. I know that one of the highest contributors to that data is the excavator. They show that directly on the dirt report. But I'm not sure how they're getting their data. Is it just simply, hey, fill out a form, this is what happened when the data happens? So I guess I would start with that question. But I would definitely think that the utility provider is going to do a lot more digging onto what happened here, because they want their locator and their excavators and whoever it is to not do that again. So they're going to want to have a little more scrape away the earth, to use the pun, but to really get down to what happened here, because I don't want this continuing over and over and over again. And that's the data I'd love to see, and find a way to start sharing that. Because I imagine what CGA gets is they get a basic report. Yes, there was a damage. This was the root cause. This is what happened. But that utility provider, I'm guessing, is getting a lot more data.
I don't know. I mean, I've submitted reports, dirt reports. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, as a me acting on behalf of a utility owner, you just take all your damages and submit it. I mean, it's really truly straight, but it's not bad at all. To your point, like it's pretty good.
Right.
There's nothing tricky about it at all. I mean, you could argue that to your point, some companies have better ways of keeping stats than others, of course. But yeah, as far as the actual reporting mechanism, I found it to be, pretty simple. If that's your question. I don't know if you've had the same experience.
No, I can't even spell IT, so they don't let me mess with that. They don't let me mess with that stuff very much. But no, I have a general understanding of the system. I have a general understanding of the purpose of the system. And I think we had mentioned it before, really, what this is going to take, in my opinion, we mentioned it earlier, is a true partnership mentality in the damage prevention industry as a whole. In other words, I'm a little more generous with my data because I think it can benefit others. And I do think it's going to take somewhat of an altruistic attitude with data and with information as a whole, so that we can impact the industry as a whole and not hold it mine, right? And, I think legal implications, I think sometimes maybe influence behaviors, but I really think it's going to take a partnership approach with all stakeholders, that we get consistent, that there's some consistency, not only in the data collection, the integrity of the data, but the people that input the data, right? In other words, all of us have to be doing it for it to be meaningful.
So we talked about sharing data and predictive analytics. Is the industry adopting the output of the sharing of data analysis, the predictive analytics, various AI products that are out there? Is the industry adopting that enough, or has it been slow to adopt it, or what might be some of the reasons for that?
I think we're at the beginning stages. We just, Jimmy, we just talked about how the data collection, right? We're trying to improve that. And in order for it to get to super meaningful, actionable, predictive items, then the front side of that's going to have to, I think, occur first. It's a little bit of the cart before the horse. I do know that the industry at varying levels is using predictive analytics, and quite frankly, when it's done, I've seen it be very successful, right? In other words, there's enough low-hanging fruit, I think, in the damage occurrence world, whether it's through training, whether it's a communication issue, whether it's a ignorance of law issue, we're using education, training, communication, some of those tools to make some significant impacts. And so, you know, yes, I think it's working, and I think that there's a lot of runway for improvement as well.
I know it's getting used. I don't know to what effect yet. I don't know if we've completely utilized it. I'm from California. I think I mentioned that to a couple of you, or maybe AJ here. But I know I've sat down and talked with some PG&E folks that were talking about taking some of the analytics and identifying this ticket is a high-risk ticket, and we're going to send 2 technicians to this ticket, and we're going to send a more senior technician. So they are doing that. They are using the data to find out if tickets are going to be a little more high-risk compared to others.
Sure.
I can't say that I know extensively what they're using or what modules they're using to come up with that data. Maybe it's internal algorithms, but I know it's getting done at some point.
You bet.
Yeah, I've seen that. There are several operators that have internal algorithms, oil and gas especially. I just know that more. I'm sure the other ones do too, but that's exactly right. You know, where we mentioned before, risky excavator. There's a naughty list that a lot of companies have of the excavators, right?
Sure.
And then, you know, the physical characteristics, as we mentioned before, of your assets, right? That will, you know, and then you can pretty simply, you know, 4 or 5 things. If these are present, then
right,
we better put an exclamation point next to the ticket, or however you do it, right?
And not just the oil and gas industry anymore.
Yep,
right?
exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
Because like I said, communications, I mean, you know, there is a lot at stake for communications companies to protect their assets in a highly competitive, I mean, it's more competitive in a communications world than it ever has been, right? And it used to be, go ahead and hit it. And, you know, your only problem was if you hit a communications line on football Saturday, right? And then somebody might come out and then you might have some problems. But today there's a real impact, a real costful impact, the damage to communications lines.
I think if you took a poll of the average American, they'd rather lose their water than their, you know, internet and Netflix.
Right.
It's sad but true.
Yeah.
Like if you want to make someone really mad, take away their internet. You know,
Connectivity is so important for all of us.
All right, thank you. We have a question from an audience member, and if anyone else has any questions, please come up. Please name and company name.
Harrison, Texas 811. I noticed that somebody mentioned, you know, there's not an incentive to report bad markings, and I absolutely agree with that. We should have an incentive to report bad markings. We don't need locators who can't mark or refuse to get trained properly. At the same time, we need an incentivization to report bad excavators. We don't need an excavator who's not going to wait for the 811 marks. We're not going to need an excavator that won't respect the utilities. So I absolutely agree with that. And there's a gap in that. And there's plenty of excavators that say, oh, I'm going to dig because what are you going to do? You're going to find me? No. And there's plenty of excavators that don't get reported because there's no one to report to. I was one of the locators that would call as many people as I could. I'd shut down the site, of course, you know, but at the same time, there's companies that get tickets that, not tickets, but fines and fees, and they build up and they don't pay them, so they shut the company down and they start up with another name, or they have somebody else do it, but they're doing the work. So, you know, with that data, we need to collect that data as well and make that into an effect, you know what I mean? As well as we're talking about how to prevent damages, you know, whether it's data, whether it's real time. The last conversation, not the last thing was that, you know, 10 years down the line after installing a utility, it's probably unlocatable because of soil conditions, whatever. I, as a locator, have seen lack of tracer wires. Either it's not installed or it's like 5 feet down, you know what I mean? Or whatever the case is, there will be no tracer wire or it won't run for whatever reason. And I see that the utility owners are more focused on development than maintenance. And that's very important too, because development is not more important than maintenance. Development is just as important, as because, you know, you can build all your new stuff, but what's happening to your loyal customers who've been with you for so long? And, you know, it makes it hard for us locators as well. So there's a buildup of different things. And I just wanted to bring this to y'all so that we can all have a discussion about it. It is important to have data. It is important to have metrics. At the same time, we have to look at the realistic things. if CGA are the people who, regulate our industry and help us be safe, we need to focus on keeping updated utilities as well. Get the old utilities out, fix the tracer wires, fix the rusty pipes and everything. Focus on that as well as development. Thank you.
You bet, thank you. No, there were some great comments, and what I heard was, there's plenty of blame to go around, or I suppose the positive side of that is all the stakeholders can make significant improvements in this area. One of the biggest things that he said that I really agree with is some kind of standardization in the damage prevention world nationally. One state a ticket's good for 72 hours, one state it's good for 48. One state has 10 ticket types, the other state has 15 ticket types, right? And some kind of standardization where everybody's singing off the same sheet of music, I think would be helpful in general.
One of the other things he said, incentives around, pointing out any negative practices out there. I don't see how, at least visually, I don't see how a program like that takes off incentivizing negative behavior, but he's absolutely correct. We need to find a way of removing these malpractices. Far too often we see someone goes to a garage sale, buys a locator, and now they're a locating company. And they're out there putting a bad stain on the industry because they were the lowest bid, and now they got this water contract and they're marking things everywhere. Whatever it might be, standardization is along with that, but finding a way, I don't know if incentivize is the right word, but finding a way to root out a lot of the fly-by-night, either excavators, locators, or anything in between.
Yeah, and I think, the point about some things are difficult to locate over time, or, assets depreciate. Another way to look at that is that it's probably already been located umpteen times.
Right.
And, as a locator, I'm a locator, but we're really reliant upon locating technique. And we probably shouldn't be that reliant on locating technique, especially if we've already located it. At some point we should write down what we're doing. So I think, I get your point about the tracer wires, but if we located it 12 times, and if we would have done some sort of data collection at one of those times, or even when it was put in, to your point, when you build new infrastructure, that would be another way of solving the same problem.
All right, thank you. We have another question from an audience here. Name, company name, and question, please.
Mario Luna. I'm a stakeholder with Astound Broadband. So as we're talking about industry performance in the system, I think it goes on both sides of the fence line, right? We got to hold accountable the stakeholders, and we got to hold accountable the people doing the work. And I think that we need to come together throughout this whole theme of these meetings that we're having. We're all talking about sharing data, getting together, but I will say that I'm not seeing a lot of action. We talk about it, but I'm not seeing anything being marked off the list. And I think that we need to get with Texas 811, have them facilitate some type of grading system, both for the utilities or the stakeholders. When there's no positive responses, let's start giving them grades. That would be the incentive to show that they're communicating, working with the system. At the same time, we need to do that to the excavators, locate companies. Start grading them. How many locates have they done, and how many hits have they taken? Same thing with excavators. And I think once we start to see those numbers, that's the incentive, right? As a stakeholder, when I go contract this work out, that's one of the things I'll be looking for, is what kind of grade did they have, what's the history, and how do we prevent that? And I think that's how we prevent damages, and that's where we talk about damage prevention or the industry performance and the system. The system is status quo. I don't see that we're taking enough action fast enough. We're not progressing as fast as technology is progressing. One of the other things I think we need to talk about is with locators is we're status quo. We're just locating the data. Traditionally, like the old assets, it's either tracer wire or it's direct buried. And we'll go back there and we do like these overbuilds, we're bringing in fiber, we're putting in conduit. And that's the time that we need to be, as we put in new conduit, is get that GPS coordinate. right? That's part of the stakeholders' investment of coming in and overbuilding these properties, but putting value to our assets, right? Using the opportunity of, through our attrition, is when we're doing these locates, is let's go ahead and grab that GPS data. But I think the pathway to get there is to start grading ourselves on both sides of the fence, both from a stakeholder perspective and from a contractor perspective in performance.
Mario, appreciate those comments, actually. I mean, it's pretty insightful. It made me think of, we were talking about damages and preventing damages and damage data and all that. And I think when we talk about the system, one of the things that's broken, or at least areas of improvement, is the amount of got of tickets and work, which we want. We want as much of that as activity as we can, but we have a static workforce, right? In other words, you had X volume last year, you predict or estimate X volume increase, so you hire and train to that, and then the volume goes all over the map, and it's a static workforce, right? So I think some efforts in trying to stabilize the volume so that the workload to workforce, so that those two could match up a little better, would also reduce damages in general.
I love the point that was made because it pointed out several different gaps, all in different locations within the system there. So each of the stakeholders, the locators, the excavators, and the facility owners, they all have a little bit of a gap in what they're providing towards each other. The facility owners, they may be providing as-built information. Here's your maps, but as-builts are only as good as they are. Typically, we call them should-have-been built. So that data may not be that good getting to the locators. The locators, as much as they are out there locating, they're not collecting the data, they're not correcting. So when they find out, no, this was actually wrong on my map, we're not correcting that and then collecting it in the system. As well as the excavators, there is no limit to the amount of tickets they can call in. They can call it 500, I need these in 48 hours, because that's what the rule is. I want all these tickets done in 48 hours. You can't. So there's no regulation to that to where, right. And all of these in a circular loop are all going to affect each other to have a flawed system, unfortunately. And each one of these individually has to raise up their level to fix a lot of these issues. Not one can say, hey, we're going to fix this and that solves everything. All three together have to.
Yeah, I mean, it is time for change. I mean, I love that. I love that spirit too. Like, let's make some meaningful changes, right? I mean, if we know that on Mondays, volume increases 50% because the weekend's over, right? And then it trickles down throughout the end of the week. Or if we know, and we know we have a static workforce, right, that can't handle volume like this, we allow it. Like, let's not, right? Or if we know after a weather event that volume increases, or after a holiday, volume increases, and it creates these massive fluctuations, let's make some changes. Let's sit down like this at whatever level, whether it's a CGA level, which I like, at a state level, which is great, right? Facilitated by a state one-call center, facilitated by an operator, we're okay with that, right? We'll facilitate it, right? But let's have the discussions. Let's pick some of the low-hanging fruit. And like Mario said, let's make some changes.
So that's
some improvements.
That's a great segue to the second part of this roundtable, which is we talked about the rules, the system, right? Both Dave and Doug just talked about it. So the question here is, are the weaknesses or opportunities, every weakness is an opportunity, are the weaknesses in the system, in the damage prevention system, are they due to the game, the rules of the game, or the players right now? Okay, so the players are various stakeholders. So how much of opportunity in damage prevention is in the improvement of the stakeholders' performance versus the improvement of the system itself, the laws, the rules, the regulations? Any thoughts?
Go ahead.
I think it's, the 100% stakeholders. If the stakeholders took more time and opportunity to update their system and their maps and stuff, it would take a lot of extra off of other people. And everything a locator, excavator, and everything does out in the field, if the stakeholder is not doing their job correctly and updating their stuff correctly, they're failing out in the field automatically. They're not, they don't have the data that they should have. And I think a lot of, at least 99% of it's a stakeholder.
So Ronnie, let me play devil's advocate here. I'm going to paraphrase what you said. If the stakeholder doesn't update their maps and stuff, and it's going to cost, the other stakeholders more time and money and maybe damages, right?
That's correct.
Isn't that a systemic issue though? Because what you just said is if I don't spend my money to update my prints to help the other stakeholders, then maybe I should. But you just said, by your definition, that I'm spending it and then others are benefiting from it. You see what I'm saying? So then my response, if I'm a profit maximizing company, as most companies in this room are, I'm going to be like, no, I'm not going to spend that because the beneficiaries of that are the other stakeholders. You see what I'm saying? So I could do that, but I'm not going to because I don't have to, and the beneficiaries are the other stakeholders. So isn't that the definition of a systemic problem?
Yeah, I would say, I mentioned it earlier, but in general, almost, if you think about it, what we're doing is we're transferring information from a utility owner to an excavator. That's what we're doing. Where's the things in the ground, right? That's one of our really big goals. And right now, as I said earlier, it's almost entirely dependent upon locating technique. I mean, that's what it is, right? You have a person out there has a map, they go out there, they locate it, they mark it, and I think that's the system, if you will. So I think if we want, I think we've, pretty close to maxed out our abilities with locating technique. I don't think there's a lot else we can do. There's really not. I mean, obviously there's some technologies like GPR, and there's, traditional contract locating, and there's obviously, positive or hydro excavation, but I think that part we've kind of maxed it out, right? So I think we have to look at, all right, well, and this is to your point, what are the other things we can do? Well, when we construct something, we can have better data. When we can change excavation practices, maybe in the design phase, we can do a lot better stuff, with stuff like that, right? Because as far as the system goes now, I don't think there's much room to improve in locating technique, unless it's just a training issue or, things like that, so.
When Jimmy introduced the question, it was somewhat of an either-or question. And I believe that all of us have plenty of improvement. If you want to say it this way, there's plenty of blame to go around. All of us can go home and take care of some things that I think would make improvements. I would lean towards the system. There's the most low-hanging fruit in kind of what I described. We have a static workforce, and we have a completely variable workflow or work volume, right, with essentially not a lot of rules. I mean, you could call in as much work as you want, however, in a lot of states, however long you want that to work. You can call in a whole county ticket if you want, et cetera. And all of that, right, instability in the type of work, the length of a ticket, the volume of a ticket, when the tickets can come in, and really no guidelines on that whatsoever, definitely significantly impact the workforce, right? A semi-static workforce. So it seems to me that there is a lot of improvement that could be made systemically in standardizing some of this, putting some limitations. Let's use this analogy, because we've all done this. You walk into a restaurant, and if there's no tables, you're waiting outside, right? And you can wait however long, but it's not like, oh yeah, come on in. Hey, sorry, we're all gonna sit with you because we have to take you, you know what I mean? So that's just one analogy of I think, where you only have so much capacity, and there is some restraints on the front end where the people come in.
Yeah, I have been, privy to conversations that I don't think you're getting at is basically like even a variable time, right? A variable ticket time, right? Where in areas of high demand, to encourage people to stop putting their tickets on Friday afternoon, you say, oh, I'm sorry, we can't take any more tickets on Monday. That's it, we're done, and I've heard, many conversations about that, right? To your point, because it does make sense to a point, because you're right, there's only so many workers. There's only so much resources dedicated by utility owners, and you can't just have everyone in the world work in September or whatever your most popular month is, right?
Sure.
So, there are ideas like that that are being floated around, which I'm sure you've been a part of, and I think they're really interesting.
Yeah, they are. There are some solutions, right? I mean, there are lots of solutions. And it seems that maybe that's most actionable, right, for all of us.
Well, and
start having those discussions.
Another thing that's nice about it is, there may not be a really quick and easy solution, but we know the problem and we have data. We have that data. We know how many tickets there were. We know when they were. That data exists, so when we say like how to get that data, we have it. That's an easy one, right? So getting the data in that case is easy, but the solution will be difficult because from the excavator standpoint, they're like, no, this is the law. But yeah, so I like what you said there, and I think there should be further conversation about how to kind of even that out.
Just to stack right back on top of what you were saying, how many times has that emergency ticket popped in, or hey, I'm digging tomorrow morning, that locator comes up to do this massive locate, whatever it might be, and there's no one there. There's no backhoe there, there's no trencher there, they're not even working. So there is no rules, and the systematic changes can put some rules in place to solve a lot of those problems to help that limited workforce out.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I think, we could go to all the stakeholders. I really think it's going to take this altruistic partnership mentality that we talked about, where we can have an excavator and a utility owner and a locator and say, okay, if we limited the amount of volume you can take in one day, what's the impact to you? What's the impact to you? What's a middle of the road solution that works for all, that makes an improvement into the system? Right, and really whiteboard those ideas. Let's get a whiteboard out and let's say, okay, what's the solution? Is it volume caps on a day? Is it, or is the solution if we hit a volume cap, then it's no longer a 48-hour ticket, then it's a 72-hour ticket or whatever. I think that there's, I tend to believe that there's a lot more smart people out there than me, and because there just are. People know more. And so let's get people involved in this discussion and whiteboard a bunch of ideas on what potential solutions are. Let's circle some and let's cross some off and end up with some actionable items on how to improve our system.
It's not a terrible idea that you had there. That's a compliment, I guess. So it was a great idea.
That's not a terrible idea.
But I want to go right back to your analogy of the restaurant. So if you want to eat at a certain restaurant that night, and it's a nice restaurant, and you have to have a reservation, if you wait an hour before to call and get a reservation, you're probably not getting a reservation, right? So the same thing, if you call in your tickets in the morning, you're probably going to get your 48-hour response. If you wait till 5 o'clock in the afternoon to put in your tickets, hey, this may be 72-hour now because you waited till the last minute to try to get these things in. So it's actually, I think, a pretty good idea to look at.
Yeah, so the restaurant analogy is a very interesting one. And I think what we have in our industry is actually worse than a restaurant. What happens in a restaurant in this case, in that if you run a restaurant, let's say it's open from 11 a.m. to 9 p.m., there are two peaks, right? There's a peak at around 12, and there's a peak at around 7 p.m. You know it. So you can adjust your staffing accordingly. In our industry, the peaks and troughs are highly random, especially in a localized area. Okay, they're very unpredictable. So it would be like if you run a restaurant and there's going to be anywhere from 1 to 5 peaks throughout the day, and you don't know what time. You'll know about it 5 minutes beforehand. Right? How do you staff for that? But Doug gave a very good example, concrete example of an idea that could help the industry, which is some kind of volume cap per day. Do any of you have any other ideas for systemic improvements that could help the players, the stakeholders, succeed more? All of us, the whole industry succeed more.
Yeah, I think the biggest opportunity in this system is in the design phase. I think that there's a lot of companies that would love to have information early on in their process, and they're building like a large-scale linear construction project or something like that. And in most places, they're not getting a lot of usable information. So from their perspective, because they're an engineering company or they're a construction company, whatever, from their perspective, they have a client that they have to please. So they'll go ahead and just put in a normal ticket because that's the only way they can get the information they want. So I think if you looked at like where, in my opinion, what we can improve design phase, and I think in that phase, that's where we got to start getting everybody to share. This is where we say, hey, here's my maps, here's your maps. You're building something next year. Let's get ahead of it, right? Because this will help with that, with that extra volume. And then just one more thing, Jimmy, I'd say that I agree to some extent with the, the unpredictability of volume, but there are some, pretty common things, right? Like, there's weather, the winter,
weather, yeah.
Monday's common, winter, stuff like that. So, it's, I just wanted to add that. I think there is something we can build from there as far as those predictive analytics.
I guess it wouldn't be a groundbreaking change or idea, but just the idea of becoming more efficient within the locating day. I think it happened in the last roundtable where they talked about by having data and then going and putting paint on the ground per data, not having to hook up and locate, you can speed up your locate quite a bit, especially on bigger locates. So now that same limited workforce can do a lot more and be more efficient if we collect data every time we're going out. So it goes back to that data collection on the front end when we're out locating these tickets and making all those repeat tickets afterwards that much quicker.
So yeah, I think you actually are on the cusp of a groundbreaking idea though, right? Because number one is more resources to do, which believe me, I love collecting data. So, I think that the groundbreaking thing, I think the surprise would be that in the design phase, I think that engineering construction companies would happily pay money for a service that's now free if the information they got was good. So think about it like a One Call Plus or whatever you think about it, right? Because instead of during that design phase, they had not a lot of information. Now, if we had the resources to start collecting that data and sharing that data, I believe that a lot of those companies say, oh wow, yeah, whatever, $50, great. Whatever it may be. So I think that's one of the crazy ideas that I have is that I think people in the design phase might be willing to pay money for information, which is, to my knowledge, never been done in the U.S.
It might be helpful too, because I think everybody can, again, this is an every stakeholder, I mean, there's more at stake today for everybody than ever. And so everybody has their improvements. One for an operator, a utility owner, may be to, if we need to have labor on the bench, sitting on the bench, have other things that we can do. And just to keep it neutral, I'll say paint fire hydrants, right? Right, so that we can have labor doing some other type of activity, and then if and when volume spikes, right? So if we were to put some controls, maybe on the front side of the volumes, and do some creative things on the backside that allowed more labor to be available, increase the labor pool by doing some other things, even a minor change on either end may make a significant difference in the system.
Yeah, like you could do a gas leak survey in the winter, and then you could do locating in the summer.
Yep. Lots of non-fire hydrant painting things that we could do, absolutely.
Mowing lawns, whatever.
Street curbs,
Yeah. Absolutely.
So great discussion. Do we have a question from the audience here? So name, company name, and question, please.
Tracy Purcell with Bloodhound. I came up to ask a question after Doug made a comment about regulatory and regulations, et cetera, and what's on the books today. Right-of-ways are shrinking. More plants going in those shrinking right-of-ways, abandoned facilities, but we're still saying in the majority of the states, it's 2 days only. It's 3 days only. The amount of tickets, I'm in a meeting earlier today in Texas, every second a ticket is being called in. But 20, 30 years ago when we had these laws on the books, we weren't even thinking about the volume we have today, not even close. Technology is going to get us part of the way, right? Training is going to get us part of the way. But does it really make sense that we can really hold the volume and get done in 2 business days, right? I mean, and I know the cons, right? Locating firms will ramp up and they're like, wait, now we have 3 days, we'll be late on 3 days. Well, now we have 4 days, now we'll be late on 4 days. But there has to be something in there to recognize volume speaking, we don't have the people, we need to do this by law, but we can't. So what are we going to do about it? And I just think there's a lot of work and improvement there, and I'd like to get your take on expanding the turnaround time on a ticket.
Yeah, Tracy, I think, eloquently said, right? I mean, I think it highlighted what we mentioned earlier is that, we do planning at the beginning of the year, just to keep it simple, on this is what we think the workload's going to be. And so we source, hire, and train that workforce, right? And that takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And then you have X amount of people, you have X amount of available labor out there with a very variable workload, right? And so I think there are a lot of ideas that we can use to standardize or stabilize that workload on the front end so that it more equally matches the workforce. For me in particular, I don't think this is the forum yet, right, to maybe whiteboard those ideas, but I think there's a lot of good ideas out there and getting smart people involved that could help with that.
Yeah, I think another way to reduce volume is just, pointless tickets, right? And, obviously I work for a hydro excavation company, so this is, but is it necessary to have a one-call ticket for hydro excavation every single time? I mean, some states don't, like New York doesn't, for example.
Right.
I mean, can we do it that way too? Can we look at these tickets aren't really, if we're going to use a hydro excavation to locate something, do we need to have it located? At this point, do we have to just look at this is kind of, or can we just locate it ourselves? Great. That's another thing. As an excavator, a hydro excavator in particular, can we just go locate it ourselves? Great. We'd love to reduce the burden on the one-call system, right? And I think that there's a lot of excavation companies that probably could do that. And they would say, yeah, we're good. We got it. There's other ways to, another way is just reduce the number of tickets is what I'm saying,
To play devil's advocate like Jimmy likes to do here, we're living in a society, in a world now, where everyone's carrying around an automatic answer generator in their pocket, right? Immediately, I can now change the brakes on my truck because I watched the 3-minute YouTube video. So I guess I challenge the idea of let's keep pushing this back and make it bigger. I think the world is going to want to say, let's make it shorter. And I think that there's answers out there to do it. I don't have them in my head, but we're trying to solve the problem now of, hey, right now we have the limited workforce, we need to push back this thing, and I think we need to start flipping it on its head and figuring out how to shrink that and say, we're going to get there within 24 hours.
Yeah, there are still ideas that you can do. Again, that's another, like I said, we need to whiteboard this. I mean, because, I think standardizing the amount of work you can put on one ticket would be helpful for all, right? There's some low-hanging fruit, maybe some volume guidelines or boundaries as it relates to day, week, month, whatever the case may be, right? So that we can match these two. I think there's a lot more ideas.
So it sounds like there's consensus that in addition to, or instead of locating harder or damage prevention more, it's doing something different, maybe doing something smarter, maybe look at the structure of the system. We have one more question from the audience, and I think this is the last one. Please name, company, and question.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. Scott Landis with Infrastructure Resources, and it's not as much of a question, just a comment. I'm sure I have the details off a little bit, but I know in Ontario, they have a system that some contractors are able to do their own locates. They actually sign a contract with the utility, and it's, it's low-risk stuff, service, drops and things like that, but it seems like that kind of concept might really help reduce the workload on those real easy locates. So just a thought.
Yeah, our organization has taken advantage of that. And sometimes it's called like an alternative. I can't remember the exact nomenclature. Maybe it's called alternative locate method. And then you can, yeah. I think that's a wonderful idea. I mean, just look at I'm from Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, the law is, you know, any movement of the dirt is a one-call ticket. You know, and then if you look at New York, you can go out and hydrovac without a one-call ticket. So to your point, I mean, how are both these things right? You know,
Yeah, standardization, where is that?
Exactly. Should it be somewhere in between, right? So I think that's a great point, Scott.
I've heard about that. I did talk to some fellows from Ontario, and they were telling me about it. I don't know enough about it to comment intelligently, but it sounds like definitely something that should be looked into, whiteboarded as you put out.
Yeah, we do a lot of locating, like, you know, stuff that we do ourselves. So, and we'll, you know, if a locator calls us, hey, do you need me over there to do this? Because I have a high volume in this area that I'm at now. If we're going to locate that anyway, then we'll relieve him of it. We'll tell him, no, you don't have to come over here because we're going to be locating that anyway. So we do that a lot.
Yeah, that's great. And we had a really big project, and there were, you know, two parts of it. And in one part, what we did is just, you know, they had a jillion locates, right? And on the other part, I got with the state's one-call center. I said, hey, what do you recommend, right? I don't want to wreck everyone's day. And so we did more of a design ticket process. And in that case, it worked really well because the locators, we didn't overburden them. We're like, hey, we just need you here. We just need you here. We just need you here. And in that case, it worked out great. I mean, it really did. And it was really interesting because it was the same project in and we did it 2 different ways. And you know, if we can establish that line of communication, you know, back and forth, it's great. You know, it really is.
Right back to best demonstrated performances. I mean, those are the things that need to be shared across excavators and locators all the same, is that practice worked out really well. I'm guessing that a bunch of other excavators are not using that same practice today. They're just calling in tickets willy-nilly and backlogging the system.
And that's another, yeah, exactly. And that's another thing, like these large scale linear construction projects, right? It's a really bad day for a locate company, right? And to your point, if you have an excavator, it's like, hey, what can we do? And then you call a one-call center, you call a locate company, like, hey, what can we do? And then you come up with a good solution. I think that's great.
Locate, we'll relieve them of it and we'll locate it because we would be locating it anyway.
Exactly.
So, you know, it helps out the locators out in the field, you know, it takes a lot of stress off because the volume I've been seeing, you know, out in West is like no other. I mean, some of the tickets I've called in over 200 locates in a week, you know, and then they'd call me back, and I was like, well, you don't have to worry about it. We got you covered. You know, so you know, because his volume was a lot, because he had a big area that he was covering. So we always try to help out any way we can.
Yeah, I think all the ideas are good, and I think that it's going to take a certain amount of humility and willingness and openness to learn new ideas from other people, other companies, other stakeholders, other countries on how things operate. And I think if we collectively have some humility, some teachability, some willingness to listen, some willingness to work together with somewhat of an altruistic attitude, I think we could come out with 2, 3, 4, 5 ideas that would make a significant impact on this industry. Let's get started.
With that, Doug, you stole my closing.
Oh, sorry.
Can we get a round of applause for this fine panel? This is the last roundtable of today, and I think we are one step closer to solving the world's problems. There's another panel tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Central Time. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thanks to everyone viewing on the stream.
Sounds good. Cool. Pleasure. That was fun.
Yeah, I
appreciate it, Doug.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Yeah.
Don't much. Thank you. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ron.